Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the stiff lace-trimmed nightmare that was the Victorian era, where morality was stitched into corsets, and the rules for women were, well, not so much rules as they were superstitions with a straitjacket. This journey? You probably won't survive it. Not if you're allergic to patriarchy, fainting couches, or ghost babies. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with a corset. Of course it does. The icon of Victorian femininity, that tightly laced, spine-rearranging contraption, wasn't just about fashion. It was, in the minds of many, a spiritual seatbelt. You slip into one, the lace is pulled tighter with each exhale, until your ribs creak and your voice turns wispy. That's not just restriction, it's virtue. A woman who couldn't breathe properly was considered morally upright. Apparently, if you could take a full breath, you were halfway to scandal. The logic? A tightly cinched waist was a sign of discipline, both physical and sexual. In other words, if you had room in your lungs, you probably had room in your schedule for sin. Of course, not every woman was thrilled about her organs being reallocated to strange corners of her torso. But protest too loudly and you'd be seen as unladylike, or worse, unwell. Because here's where the superstition kicked in. Doctors and moralists insisted that the corset not only protected your virtue but your uterus too. Without it, they claimed, your reproductive organs would float freely like helium balloons, wreaking havoc in your abdomen. It's a lovely image. Your uterus drifting up to chat with your lungs, maybe saying hello to your spleen on the way. The idea of a wandering womb wasn't just metaphor, it was accepted medical folklore, and it justified a lot of terrible decisions. The results? Women fainted. A lot. It became so routine that every proper drawing room had a fainting couch. No one ever asked why women were constantly passing out. They just assumed it was delicate nerves or lady brains overheating. In reality, it was blood flow, shockingly, being cut off by a glorified bone corset. But that explanation lacked poetry. The Victorian mind loved its drama. One actual case documented at the time describes a woman whose corset was so tight she developed what they delicately called thoracic displacement. That's a polite way of saying her lungs were no longer where lungs are supposed to be. Yet instead of adjusting her wardrobe, doctors recommended bed rest, prayer, and tighter spiritual focus. In other words, lie still and reflect on your sin of wanting to breathe. Corsetry was also an arms race. Waist sizes were bragging rights. 19 inches was admirable, 16 was divine. Never mind that your digestive system was now shaped like a treble clef. Women competed quietly, carefully, and obsessively, and corset makers happily encouraged it, promising moral posture alongside wasp-like allure. It wasn't just about looking small, it was about shrinking into the idea of who a woman should be. Quirky fact time, corsets had metal or whalebone stays, and when these broke under pressure, either from use or poor craftsmanship, they could stab the wearer. Yes, women literally died from corset injuries. One infamous case from 1874 tells of a young woman who tripped on the stairs, and the force of her fall snapped a steel stay that punctured her heart. The coroner reportedly called it death by fashion. Victorian newspapers used the phrase like it was a normal Tuesday. Now, not every expert agreed on corsets being moral armour. Some progressive, deeply unpopular physicians warned against them. Wonder William Acton argued that corsets were a device of modesty gone mad. But unsurprisingly, many Victorian men preferred women unable to move quickly, or at all. A breathless woman was a controllable one, and an immobilised one even more so. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the corset was more about aesthetics or submission. The lines blur. What's clear is this: the tighter the corset, the more society approved. Yet in private, some women rebelled. They wore reform corsets, looser and more humane, or even ditched them entirely during unchaperoned moments. Imagine the scandal of walking freely, lungs full of air, spine aligned, like some kind of radical feminist bird. But they paid for it with whispers, raised eyebrows, and social frost. Because even if your corset didn't physically kill you, stepping outside the corseted ideal could socially destroy you. The contradiction is almost poetic. In a society that prized domestic angels, The tools of morality were little torture devices. The corsets sat at the intersection of superstition and societal control, part fashion, part religious relic, part medical myth. You wore one to prove you were good. You wore one to hide your breath, your curves, your hunger. You wore one so your uterus wouldn't float up and mess with your brain. So tonight, as you settle into bed in stretchy pyjamas or an oversized hoodie, maybe spare a moment for the women who fell asleep each night with their ribs bound, their organs squeezed, and their worth measured by inches. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the creak of whalebone and the soft gasp of someone trying to breathe without making noise. You run your fingers through your hair without thinking. Maybe it's tangled, maybe you're just bored, but congratulations, you've already committed a minor Victorian sin. See, in the world you've slipped into tonight, hair isn't just hair. It's a moral billboard, a social status, and a slightly haunted relic all wrapped into one. Victorian society looked at a woman's hair the way modern folks might look at a resume, a diary, and maybe a slightly cursed family heirloom, because every strand told a story, and most of those stories were tightly policed. Long hair, and we're talking really long, waist length at the very least, wasn't just preferred, it was required if you wanted to be seen as pure, demure, and obedient. Chopping it off, that was practically a declaration of rebellion, and not the cool punk rock kind, more like the scandalous "is she unwell" kind. A woman with cropped hair might as well have announced she was a witch, a widow, or, gasp, a suffragette. Each of those labels came with its own whisper campaign, and depending on how severe the haircut, possibly an exorcism. There was a deep superstition that hair carried spiritual energy, especially for women. Victorian thinkers borrowed heavily from old European folk beliefs, which claimed that hair stored life force. The longer it grew, the more of your essence it contained. Losing your hair, voluntarily or not, was seen as a kind of metaphysical unravelling. That's why cutting it, even trimming it, was considered deeply suspicious. And if you happened to shed a few too many strands naturally, well, that might be a sign you were fading, spiritually or physically. Or worse, being drained by something unnatural. But wait, it gets better. Or weirder. A popular belief held that hair, especially from women who had passed away, could retain ghostly attachments, which led to one of the most disturbing trends of the Victorian age: mourning jewellery made from the hair of dead relatives. You heard that right. People wore rings, brooches, and lockets filled or woven with hair from the dearly departed, like little pockets of haunting you could pin to your chest. And if it was your mother's hair, your sister's, or even your child's, well, that was seen as tragically beautiful. But a woman cutting and saving her own hair, that was seen as morbid and deranged. So imagine being a young Victorian woman in your 20s, your hair finally long enough to pin into a heavy chignon, and someone dares to suggest that shorter hair might be freer or healthier. You'd laugh nervously, tighten your bun, and pretend you never heard it, because the idea of freedom was terrifying if it came with split ends. Now here's a real historical gem. Queen Victoria herself kept a lock of Prince Albert's hair in a locket she wore daily after his death. Entire decades after. People saw this as the pinnacle of romantic devotion. But if a working-class woman did the same for a lost lover, she might be considered unstable or accused of dabbling in necromantic rituals. That's the beauty of superstition. It often depends entirely on your social class. There were even rules about how and when you could show your hair. Letting it down in public was unthinkable, scandalous even. That was reserved for private moments, typically in the presence of your husband or the mirror. If a woman was seen with her hair loose in the street, it was often assumed she was either insane or a sex worker, or both, because the two were often lazily conflated. Artists of the time loved painting women with loose hair in dramatic backlit scenes. Viewers called it wild beauty or mad sensuality. But the actual women who dared go out with their hair untied, they got moral lectures, not fan mail. Then there's the quirky superstition about brushing. The belief was that brushing your hair 100 strokes before bed made you not only beautiful but also spiritually balanced. Some women took this as sacred ritual, brushing by candlelight, counting softly like they were invoking something. Others feared that skipping the ritual might invite bad dreams, or even malevolent spirits. One fringe belief even claimed that unbrushed hair could trap negative energy. Think of it like a ghost catcher perched right on your scalp. If you had a restless night or bad luck the next day, well, maybe you missed stroke number 87. Hair was also tied to virginity. No, not in any scientific way. Don't ask the Victorians for biology. The logic was symbolic. Long, untouched hair equals long, untouched life. If a woman cut her hair after marriage, it was seen as natural. If she did it before, questions would arise. Lots of whispering, lots of theories, and if she did it and claimed it was for comfort, that was seen as code for, I've lost my virtue and now I must punish my follicles. An ongoing scholarly debate tries to separate how much of this hair obsession was about religion versus control versus fashion. Some historians argue it was an extension of Christianity's views on women and modesty, and others think it was more about the rising influence of Romanticism, which idolised tragic heroines with flowing hair and emotional instability. Still others point to plain old patriarchy, that trusty villain, which found 1,000 poetic ways to tell women how to style themselves. But no matter the root cause, the result was the same. A woman's hair wasn't hers. It was a public statement, a moral contract, a superstitious vessel. You kept it long, you kept it neat, and you never let it fall around your shoulders unless you wanted your neighbours to assume you were spiralling into lunacy, or poetry, which was basically the same thing in their eyes. So as you lie there, your hair maybe mussed from the pillow or tucked behind one ear, remember that in another time that simple comfort would have been loaded with meaning. Every strand said something, whether you liked it or not. And the next time you get a trim just because you're in the mood for change, be glad no one's clutching pearls or drawing protective symbols in the margins of their prayer book. You're feeling a little off. Maybe anxious, maybe restless. You cried yesterday for no reason, and today you laughed a little too loud at something that wasn't funny. It's fine, you're human. But if this were the Victorian era, congratulations, you'd officially be diagnosed with hysteria. No exams, no blood work, no real questions asked. Just one word to wrap up every inconvenient emotion, every bout of sadness, every flicker of anger, sexual desire, fatigue, boredom, or actual trauma. Hysteria. The ultimate Victorian catch-all for woman being a person. The concept wasn't new, it dates back to ancient Greece, where doctors believed a woman's uterus could wander around her body causing trouble, like some kind of misbehaving roommate. But the Victorians put their own melodramatic spin on it. They believed that hysteria was a real, physical illness, unique to women, that needed immediate treatment, mostly because it made women act in ways that were unpredictable, embarrassing, or just deeply annoying to men. You didn't smile at your husband today. Hysteria. You read a novel and felt feelings? Hysteria. You wanted to go outside without a chaperone? Full-blown breakdown. Doctors, always men of the course, loved diagnosing it. It made their lives easier. Instead of listening to a woman's complaints, they could just slap on the hysteria label and shuffle her off for treatment, which could mean anything from cold baths to full-on institutionalization. The worst part, it was considered completely normal. Husbands were encouraged to report their wives. Fathers could request evaluations. A woman who stepped outside the narrow lines of acceptable behaviour could find herself wearing a padded dress in a locked room, all in the name of medicine. And what were the symptoms? Literally everything. Fatigue, headaches, anxiety, daydreaming, being too sexual, not being sexual enough, some moles, having opinions, crying, not crying. It was like being a contestant in a twisted game where existing was the only rule, and you still lost. One list from an 1859 medical journal included over 75 different symptoms of hysteria, ranging from shortness of breath to vague desires and tendency to write poetry. Apparently even a bad sonnet could land you in a clinic. Of course there were treatments. Terrifying, condescending treatments. Some women were prescribed rest cures, where they were forced to stay in bed for weeks at a time, forbidden to read, write, or even talk to people. Others were subjected to electrical stimulation, cold showers, or the infamous pelvic massage performed by doctors who believed sexual release, strictly clinical, of course, was the cure. Yes, you heard that right. In a wild twist of logic, some Victorian physicians treated hysteria with what they called hysterical paroxysm, which modern ears will recognise as, well, an orgasm, from your doctor, in an office, sometimes with a hand crank machine, and then they acted shocked when the patients felt better. This led to the invention of the vibrator, not as a fun little device, but as a time-saving tool for overworked physicians who couldn't keep up with all the hysterical women queuing up for appointments. The earliest electric vibrators were massive, awkward contraptions that hummed ominously and were considered perfectly respectable medical equipment. Ads for these machines appeared in magazines right next to ads for sewing machines and headache powders. No one blinked an eye. This was science. This was therapy. But underneath all the wires and white coats was a simple, disturbing truth. women weren't allowed to have complex emotions. So those emotions had to be pathologized. The cultural message was clear: if you're upset, there must be something wrong with your body. Probably your uterus. Again, the word hysteria comes from the Greek hystra, meaning womb. It was a diagnosis born out of anatomical superstition. Your uterus made you unreliable, emotional, dangerous, and conveniently, no matter what you did, your uterus was to blame. There's an open debate among historians about whether hysteria was ever real, or at least real in the way Victorians imagined. Some argue it was a social construct, a tool for suppressing women's autonomy. Others think some patients truly suffered psychosomatic symptoms brought on by the extreme restrictions of their lives. Boredom, repression, trauma. In either case, it wasn't being treated, it was being punished. And the institutions, don't even get started on those. Women sent to rest homes for hysteria were often kept in bleak, echoing rooms with barred windows and nothing to do but stare at the walls. No books, no visitors, just silence, and maybe the occasional visit from a doctor with a prescription for more silence. Some women were committed for months, others for life, all because they didn't fit into someone else's version of calm femininity. Quirky sidebar. There were even fashion guides that advised on how to dress a recovering hysteric. Pastel colours were thought to soothe the nerves. No sharp lines or dark fabrics. Those might trigger episodes. You couldn't just look sane, you had to accessorise your way back to mental health. If all this is sounding a bit like a gothic novel, you're not wrong. The trope of the mad woman in the attic didn't come from nowhere. Authors like Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote thinly veiled protests against the rest cure and the entire idea of female insanity. Her story. The yellow wallpaper still haunts readers with its depiction of a woman who's slowly driven mad by isolation and condescension masquerading as care. It was a horror story drawn from real life, and for too many Victorian women it hit disturbingly close to home. So here you are, lying in bed, maybe replaying that awkward conversation from earlier, or wondering why you feel weirdly emotional tonight. Imagine having those thoughts 150 years ago and someone calling the doctor. Imagine explaining your inner world to a man who believes your uterus is attacking your brain. Imagine being told that rest, silence, and possibly a jolt of electricity will fix you. That's the nightmares Victoria women lived inside. And some never got out. You know how sometimes you get a weird vibe in an old room, or the hair on your arms rises for no reason, and you think, this place feels haunted? Now imagine if Victorian society took that feeling, wrapped it in lace, blamed your reproductive system and turned it into a whole belief system. Welcome to the deeply strange world of Victorian spiritualism. Specifically, the idea that your uterus might be some sort of ghost beacon. Yep, ghosts in the womb. You heard that right. See, the 19th century wasn't just the age of industrialisation and tea sets. It was also the heyday of séances, mediums, ectoplasm, and people asking dead relatives for stock advice. Spiritualism exploded across the Western world, promising a connection to the beyond that felt more immediate than the stiff pews of Sunday church. And at the heart of it, surprise, were women. Medium, sensitive, spirit whisperers. Victorian women were believed to be more in tune with the ethereal plane, more open to unseen forces, but not because of their intuition or empathy. No, it was because of their biology. According to many spiritualists and fringe doctors, the female reproductive system, particularly the womb, acted as a sort of spiritual antenna. It was sensitive, mysterious, and perpetually misunderstood. That made it, in their minds, a perfect conduit for communication with the other side. The logic, spirits being subtle and immaterial, could pass through or even inhabit parts of the body that were similarly unknowable. And what was more unknowable than a uterus in an era where doctors barely understood how menstruation worked? There were stories of women entering trances during séances and claiming to feel coldness in their abdomen. Clear evidence, they said, that a ghost had made contact through the womb. Some claimed to channel messages from dead children and insisted the presence could be felt near the seat of life. It was all very poetic, very dramatic, and very creepy. One infamous case in 1868 involved a medium named Lydia, who claimed her stillborn child's spirit had returned and lived inside her belly as a source of psychic power. The séances were hugely popular. She became a sensation. But behind the velvet curtains, doctors debated whether she needed an exorcist or an asylum. For some women, though, this strange belief gave them an odd kind of power. In a society that silenced them in daily life, suddenly they were being listened to in the dark, literally. People would gather in hushed candlelit rooms to hear a woman speak with the voice of a long-dead uncle, or a soldier lost at sea. These women, mediums, were treated with awe, respect, and a healthy dose of fear. And yet, their authority always came with an asterisk. It wasn't them speaking, it was the spirits. The moment a woman claimed too much agency or interpretation, she risked losing credibility. Or worse, being accused of fraud or demonic possession, because of course. The truly bizarre part, some spiritualist groups believed that pregnancy could disrupt a woman's spiritual connection. The idea was that a living fetus somehow crowded out any spectral visitors, like a rude party guest hogging the punch bowl. So pregnant mediums were sometimes discouraged from working. Others insisted that unmarried women made the best conduits, since their wombs were, in theory, empty and receptive. You can almost hear the patriarchy patting itself on the back for that one. But let's not pretend this belief system was all scented candles and whispered messages. There was a dark undercurrent. The same uterus that could invite spirits was also suspected of attracting the wrong kind of energy: evil spirits, vengeful ghosts, demonic presences. If a woman reported dreams, visions, or hearing voices, she might be celebrated as a mystic or accused of harbouring something unholy. One particularly odd superstition warned that excessive use of one's psychic womb could cause permanent damage, leading to barrenness or madness. Because if something couldn't be controlled, it needed to be pathologized. Fringe fact time, some Victorian spirit photographers claimed they could capture auras radiating from the pelvic region of female mediums during séances. The images, blurry and full of lens flares, were paraded as proof that the womb emitted a spiritual glow. Skeptics, of course, pointed out that long exposures and a few smoke tricks could produce the same effect, but believers weren't interested in optics lessons. They were convinced that women, especially virginal or grieving ones, were walking ghost lanterns. All of this leaves historians in a fascinating bind. Was this belief system liberating for some women, giving them a rare platform and public role, or was it just another form of control, dressed up in mysticism and scented with myrrh? The scholarly debate continues. Some argue that spiritualism let women perform gender in new ways, disrupting expectations and gaining rare influence. Others point out that the system still placed female power within the confines of passivity, the body, and submission to unseen forces. You could be a mouthpiece, yes, but never the voice. And then there's the undeniable fear underneath it all. Victorian society was terrified of female bodies, not just because of what they could do, but because of what they might invite. Power that didn't come from a man was immediately suspect. So it was easier to call it supernatural, easier to say it came from spirits, or sickness, or wombs that drifted like fog. As you lie there in the dark tonight, listening to your own quiet breath, though, you might wonder how many women were locked in this strange paradox, hailed as mystics in the parlour and dismissed as mad women in the daylight. How many carried real grief, real voices, and were only heard when pretending it wasn't their own words? How many found strength in superstition because no one offered them science, or truth, or choices? And maybe you'll feel a little chill. Nothing serious, just the breeze from your fan or a trick of your thoughts. But in the Victorian world, someone might ask, was that a ghost? Or just something your uterus picked up along the way? You've probably stared at the moon before, out your bedroom window on a late walk, or while trying to untangle some existential thought you weren't quite ready to say out loud. Maybe it felt comforting, mysterious, romantic. But if you were a woman in Victorian times, gazing too long at that glowing orb in the sky came with a health warning. No, seriously, moonlight wasn't just pretty, it was dangerous. You might be overcome with lunacy, and not just the poetic kind. Victorians believed the moon could literally scramble your brain, especially if you were a woman. This fear wasn't new. The term lunatic comes straight from the Latin luna, meaning moon. But the Victorians, being champions of pseudoscience wrapped in ruffled collars, really ran with the idea. They believed that the female body, already prone to mystical fluctuations, according to their nonsense theories, was particularly vulnerable to the gravitational and spiritual pull of the moon. If you were caught moonbathing, especially alone, your mind could start to unravel. You might lose your reason, you might faint, you might fall into a trance and never quite come out of it. In fact, women were warned not to sleep near windows when the moon was full. The soft, silvery light was thought to creep in and excite the nerves, especially in unmarried women. A particularly persistent belief held that young women who let moonlight touch their bare skin while menstruating could become infertile, hysterical, or possessed. Let that one sink in. Sleeping near moonlight during your period could summon spirits and ruin your reproductive future. You could just imagine a poor girl being dragged away from a windowsill because someone noticed a beam of light on her shoulder and gasped like it was a snake. Now here's the weird twist. Some of this fear was couched in what we'd now call science adjacent. Victorians noticed the moon's effect on tides and, deciding that people are mostly water, figured it must also tug at human fluids. Women, of course, were believed to be more fluid, emotionally, physically, hormonally, therefore more moon-sensitive. The logic is like a Pinterest conspiracy board written in cursive. Quack doctors, who often still wore very serious hats, sold protective tonics to shield sensitive female systems from the lunar influence. These elixirs usually included things like opium, wine, and mysterious herbs, so they probably worked in the sense that you stopped worrying about the moon and started hallucinating about garden gnomes. But they weren't cheap, and women who couldn't afford them were told to stay indoors during full moons or risk slipping into a shadow of themselves. And of course, the moon didn't just cause madness, it also inspired crime. One urban legend from the 1880s told of a woman in rural England who went sleepwalking during a full moon and murdered a goose with a pair of knitting needles. The goose part is hilarious. The implications were not. She was committed to an asylum the next day, and her neighbours whispered for years that she'd been touched by the night. And while that sounds like the title of a bad vampire romance, it was shorthand for, "Don't trust her, she's not all there." The belief in lunar-induced madness even crept into architecture. Some women's hospitals were built with deliberately moonless wings, rooms that had thick curtains, no windows, or specially angled ceilings that blocked celestial beams. Nurses were instructed to check at night to ensure that patients weren't exposed, and if a woman happened to show signs of distress or insomnia around the full moon, it wasn't her emotions or her circumstances, it was the sky. Better sedate her just to be safe. There's a fringe belief that still lingers today, whispered among some corners of alternative medicine, that moonlight affects ovulation or fertility. It traces its roots straight back to Victorian superstition, though now it's wrapped in talk of divine feminine energy and moon cycles instead of madness and fainting spells. Different language, same undercurrent, the idea that the moon controls you, not the other way around. Of course, there were always skeptics. A few progressive thinkers of the time challenged the lunar hysteria theory, pointing out rightfully that men were also moody, erratic, and occasionally deranged. But those voices were drowned out by the poetry-loving public who found the image of a moonstruck woman far more palatable than the idea of, say, a woman with legitimate opinions or mental illness caused by, trauma, or boredom, or corsets. There's a scholarly debate about whether moon-related diagnoses were more common in certain classes of women. Wealthy women with time to take nightly strolls and lounge near moonlit windows were more likely to be labelled lunar sensitives. Working-class women, meanwhile, were usually just called lazy, drunk, or hysterical in the traditional non-celestial way. So even in superstition there were class distinctions. Rich women were delicate flowers blooming under the lunar kiss. Poor women were just trouble. So what was really going on? Most likely women in these moonlit scenarios were sleep-deprived, emotionally exhausted, or just finally alone with their thoughts for 5 seconds, which, let's be honest, can be terrifying. But instead of being offered support or understanding, they were blamed for engaging with a glowing rock in the sky. Classic. Tonight, if you're lying there with moonlight sliding across your bed sheets, take a moment to enjoy the silence, the softness, the calm. You don't need to fear the moon. It's not going to drive you mad or meddle with your reproductive system. But for women in the Victorian era, that gentle light wasn't peaceful, it was a threat, a possible trigger, a silvery spotlight that might expose them to forces they couldn't understand and punishments they didn't deserve. And still, many of them stared up at it anyway, maybe hoping to find something bigger than themselves, maybe just needing a break from the crushing weirdness of their lives, or maybe, just maybe, hoping the moon really did have power and was finally ready to share it. So now imagine this. You wake up one morning in Victorian England, maybe a little bloated, maybe a little achy. Your back hurts, you feel off, a bit dizzy, your appetite's weird. It's nothing serious, but if you tell anyone, especially a doctor, he might lean in gravely and declare, "Ah, yes, classic case of the wandering womb." And just like that, your uterus has become a nomad. Yes, this was a real belief. For centuries, and still echoing loudly in the 19th century, it was widely accepted by physicians that the female uterus could literally move around your body. Like a hormonal Roomba, it could drift upward, downward, sideways, anywhere it pleased really, causing illness, emotional instability, and even spiritual disruption. One minute it's minding its business, the next it's crowding your lungs or bumping up against your liver. Naturally, you're crying about something you can't quite explain, or fainting, or hysterical, or just annoying. It's easy to laugh now, but back then, this idea gave doctors an all-purpose excuse for every unexplained female ailment. Anxiety, wandering womb, insomnia, probably your uterus got too close to your brain, indigestion, you guessed it, uterus on the move. Some medical manuals even had diagrams like bizarre treasure maps showing where the womb might rest during different phases of a woman's life. One especially inventive theory suggested that sadness was caused by the womb coiling itself like a sleeping serpent near the heart. Who needs antidepressants when you've got mythological organs? Treatments, of course, were absurd, the most popular one, uterine repositioning. This could include massage, herbal compresses, or, for the especially lucky, an internal manual adjustment, courtesy of a male physician with a glorified salad tong. Some women were told to wear weights around their waists to anchor the womb in place as if it were a helium balloon threatening to float out of their belly buttons. Others were prescribed soothing scents for the nose and offensive smells near the lower half to literally chase the uterus back to where it belonged. Yes, they tried to smoke it out. Lavender near the nose, burning sulphur near the pelvis, like some kind of sadistic aromatherapy. It gets worse. Some practitioners believed that the uterus wandered out of loneliness. It missed being pregnant, poor thing. Therefore, the best way to tame it was, you guessed it, marriage and frequent intercourse. Apparently the uterus just needed company. These ideas weren't whispered at the fringes of society either. They were published in respectable journals, taught in medical schools, and implemented in both urban hospitals and dusty country clinics. If a woman's symptoms didn't make sense, blame the organ with a passport. One fringe but fascinating theory claimed that wombs moved in response to moral distress. So if a woman was intellectually frustrated, sexually repressed, or socially isolated, her uterus might try to escape the body entirely. That's right. Victorian medicine basically said, if your life sucks enough, your uterus might literally try to bail. It was both medical explanation and metaphor, wrapped into one very shaky diagnosis. And of course, this belief only applied to women. Men with their contained and stable bodies weren't at risk of internal organ wanderlust. Women, by contrast, were seen as porous, emotional and biologically unpredictable, walking haunted houses where anything might shift at any time. The wandering womb wasn't just a superstition, it was a weapon, a way to frame women as inherently unstable, incapable of full autonomy, and always in need of male supervision, especially of the medical kind. This belief bled into how women were treated socially. A woman who changed her mind, who experienced mood swings, who refused marriage, or who simply acted differently, could be quietly labelled as unwell, and the suspicion of a displaced womb was enough to disqualify her from making her own choices. Some families used it as a reason to commit daughters or sisters to institutions. Others used it as an excuse to bring in doctors who would prescribe bed rest, isolation, or, let's not forget, unspeakably invasive treatments. All because an organ didn't know its place. Historical records show some women knew the system was ridiculous, but felt powerless to resist it. In private letters and journals, you find accounts of women sarcastically referring to their migrating miseries, or joking about their wombs taking walks without permission. But humour, while a small rebellion, couldn't protect them from the larger consequences. Once you were labelled womb sick, your credibility vanished, and if you protested, that was just more evidence that your uterus had made it to your brain. There's an open academic debate about how seriously doctors truly took this theory by the mid-Victorian era. Some argue that most educated physicians knew it was nonsense, but used it as a convenient shorthand for undiagnosed conditions, endometriosis, depression, autoimmune diseases, things they didn't yet have names for. Others suggest that even if the doctors doubted the literal truth of the wandering womb, They still leaned into it because it reinforced a very convenient hierarchy: male reason, or female irrationality. Meanwhile, alternative health movements began to push back. Women-led clinics, spiritual healers, and nervous specialists started suggesting that perhaps the womb wasn't to blame for everything. Maybe it was the corsets, or the isolation, or radical idea. Maybe it was the lack of real agency in women's lives that made them feel sick. These voices were few and often mocked, but they planted the seeds of resistance, seeds that would eventually bloom into something stronger. But not yet, not for most. Quirky fact, there were even womb-related fortune-telling methods. Some spiritualists believed they could place a pendulum over a woman's abdomen and predict emotional turbulence or future fertility based on the direction it swung. Think of it as the Victorian Magic 8 Ball, but with more medical gaslighting. Tonight your organs are exactly where they should be. No sulphur, smoke required. But for the women of that era, the simple act of feeling unwell became a moral failing, biological betrayal, and sometimes a life sentence. The idea that a part of your body might be quietly betraying you, drifting towards sin or madness, wasn't just superstition, it was fear weaponized. And for many women, it became the script that dictated the rest of their lives. So next time you feel off, tired, or just annoyed at the world, remember, it's probably not your uterus trying to climb into your chest cavity. It's just being human. Something Victorian society was never really comfortable letting women do. Picture this: you're a Victorian lady, freshly bathed, corset slightly loosened, hair combed into a respectable but definitely heavy braid. You're finally alone, the oil lamp casting that warm golden glow across your sitting room. And what do? You crack open a novel, something indulgent, romantic, maybe even a little tragic. A book where the heroine thinks for herself. Maybe she even runs away with a poet. Scandalous. You're 3 chapters in when your aunt walks in and gasps like you've just summoned Beelzebub himself. Because in this world, books aren't just dangerous. They're corrupting, specifically for women, and not just the saucy ones. Even reading too much was seen as a risk to your physical and moral health. Yes, welcome to another baffling superstition. The widespread belief that too much reading could literally damage a woman's body, particularly her uterus. There was a fear, often framed as concern, that if a woman read too many novels, her reproductive system would wither from neglect. The logic: your brain only had so much energy, and if you used it all on thinking, there wouldn't be any left for growing babies. If you've ever been told you can't have it all, now imagine that argument with more lace and less science. Victorian medical journals warned that excessive reading caused uterine displacement, mental overstimulation, and in extreme cases, reproductive sterility through neglect of feminine instinct. Reading was fine in moderation, but novels, fiction, escapism, absolutely not, especially if they were French. French novels were seen as the literary equivalent of absinthe and scandal, utterly intoxicating and morally catastrophic. So of course women loved them. This wasn't just about moral panic, it was a full-blown health crisis in the eyes of the establishment. Some doctors claimed that the strain of reading could permanently damage the delicate female brain. And if a woman read during puberty, forget it. The hormonal chaos combined with story-induced emotional stimulation was apparently enough to derail her development entirely. Instead of becoming a proper wife and mother, she might become literary, maybe even a whisper independent. And don't think for a second it was just fiction causing panic. Scientific or philosophical texts were even more suspect. Women reading Darwin? Dangerous. Women reading Voltaire? Unthinkable. The fear here wasn't subtle. Knowledge might give women ideas, and ideas might lead to rebellion. Or worse, opinions, and nobody wanted an opinionated uterus wandering around causing trouble. Better to keep women busy with embroidery, light piano, and acceptable reading, like the Bible, household manuals, or anything so dull it might actually subtract IQ points. There were even recommended reading times. According to one expert, women should only read in the late morning when their minds were fresh and unlikely to wander. Reading after dusk? Risky. Reading in bed? Absolutely forbidden. The dim light might strain the eyes, yes, but more importantly, you might get too involved. You might cry, you might seek style, you might feel something. That was always the real threat. Women feeling too much, thinking too much, wanting more than their limited world allowed. Quirky fact for you, one etiquette guide from the 1860s warned young women that reading novels might cause them to fall in love with imaginary men and become emotionally unavailable to real suitors, which is hilarious when you consider the suitors at the time were probably deeply boring and very into monocles. But yes, fictional crushes were seen as a problem. Your emotional bandwidth needed to stay reserved for eligible bachelors with land and maybe a moustache. Some families went as far as to lock away certain books, literally. Glass-fronted cabinets with keys, usually held by the father or older brother. A young woman could request a book, and if to pass the household morality test, it might be loaned to her. Maybe. Slowly. Like contraband. Books that explored themes of passion, death, philosophy, or independence? Off limits. If a character dared to break societal norms, especially a female character, then clearly she was a bad influence. And reading her story might lead you down the same wayward path. Of course, not everyone bought into this nonsense. There were progressive voices, often women, who argued passionately for education and reading as a vital part of female development. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft had been saying it for decades, that women's minds deserved the same nourishment as men's, but those voices were still drowned out by a chorus of "too much reading will ruin your marriage prospects," and "emotional overstimulation may cause uterine rebellion." There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how deeply these beliefs were held. Some historians suggest the anti-reading hysteria was more prevalent among the upper classes, where daughters had time for novels and families had reputations to protect. Among working-class women, books were rarer, and the fear was less about literature and more about losing control of female labour. But in all cases, the theme was the same. Literacy was power, and power in the hands of women, especially solitary, unapproved power, was a threat, and yet women kept reading, in secret. In stolen moments, by candlelight, behind doors, with pages tucked behind hymnals. Books were escapes, and sometimes the only voice telling them that life could be different, that maybe love didn't have to mean submission, that maybe sorrow could be voiced, that maybe, just maybe, their thoughts were worth having. Some women wrote too, carefully, quietly, under pseudonyms. Many of the era's greatest female authors had to pretend to be men just to get published. The irony is almost too rich. Society said reading made women hysterical, while women were writing the very books that would outlast the men who dismissed them. So as you lie there tonight, maybe listening to a bit of wind against your window, or the ticking of a distant clock, think of all the women who read in silence, risking their reputation for a glimpse of freedom, for a page that whispered back you are not alone. And maybe the next time someone rolls their eyes at your reading habits, you can smile quietly and know, if reading makes you dangerous, you're in very good company. You're 27, unmarried, and for the 5th time this week, someone has kindly, passive-aggressively suggested you should consider your future. Not because they care about your goals or your ambitions, but because your uterus, apparently, is on a ticking clock, and society is starting to panic. In Victorian England, your options are limited. You can marry, settle into the role of dutiful wife and baby factory, or, well, if you don't, people start assuming something's wrong, emotionally, morally, medically, enter one of the most damaging Victorian superstitions of all, the belief that long-term celibacy would drive a woman mad. Celibacy wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was practically a diagnosis waiting to happen. If you weren't married by your early 20s, you were already being watched closely for signs of nervous instability. Not enough sparkle in your eyes, probably because you were sexually deprived, a bit fidgety. Perhaps your unused reproductive system was causing internal distress. Everything could be explained by the absence of a husband. Everything. This wasn't entirely random. It sprang from a deep cultural paranoia that a woman's natural state required constant male influence. Without it, her physical and emotional systems would spiral into chaos. Virginity was precious, sure, but only in a transitional way. You were supposed to be a virgin on your wedding night, not indefinitely. An unclaimed woman was seen as stagnant, incomplete, and increasingly unstable. They even had a name for her, spinster, which, let's be honest, sounds less like a life choice and more like a fairy tale curse. The Victorian medical establishment leaned hard into this narrative. Women who remained unmarried into their 30s were at high risk, allegedly, for everything from hysteria to melancholia to paroxysms of self-delusion. One physician wrote that unmarried women were vessels unemptied, and the use of that phrase tells you everything you need to know about how they viewed female bodies, as containers waiting to be filled. Emotionally, sexually, even spiritually, to not be used was to be wasted, and waste in the medical mind of the era meant decay. So what happened to women who stayed single? Many were simply pitied. Some were shamed, but others, those who didn't conform, who seemed a bit too independent, were diagnosed. And if you got slapped with a diagnosis, it could lead to treatment, which in those days meant rest cures, institutionalization, or worse. Some women were even prescribed marriage as a medical remedy. Not kidding, doctors would advise families to find suitable matches to stabilize their daughters, as if husbands were vitamins. The darker side of this superstition played out in asylums. Records show that many women admitted to mental hospitals were unmarried and had no family advocate. Their symptoms range from depression to anxiety to being inconvenient. Once inside, they were rarely treated as individuals. Their unmarried status became shorthand for problematic, and treatment focused less on healing and more on containment. Fringe fact: there was a short-lived but deeply weird medical theory that sexual congestion could cause swelling of the brain. For women, this was interpreted as a reason to either marry or undergo medical procedures to relieve the tension. And yes, this is a polite way of saying that some doctors performed or prescribed, you guessed it, pelvic massages to treat what was essentially a fabricated problem. Victorian medicine really did love inventing issues just to justify very invasive solutions. But here's the twist. While society feared unmarried women, it also needed them. Enter the figure of the maiden aunt, the governess, the teacher, the spinster neighbour who helped with everything from child-rearing to bookkeeping. These women were essential, quietly holding up households and institutions, but they had to walk a tightrope. Too assertive and they were suspicious, too reserved and they were considered emotionally stunted. And heaven forbid they took an interest in art, writing or travel. Those were red flags for loneliness, deviance, or, inevitably, madness. There's still an academic debate about whether these women were genuinely seen as unstable, or if it was simply the easiest way to strip them of autonomy. Labelling a woman as mad because she refused marriage removed her credibility, her voice, her power, and in some cases, her freedom. A woman declared incompetent could be placed under the care of male relatives indefinitely. So maybe the real fear wasn't about her mental health, maybe it was about control. And yet despite the risk, many women resisted. They built lives on the margins, quietly radical, deeply intentional. Some became writers, intellectuals, philanthropists. Others lived with other women in what were euphemistically called Boston marriages, long-term partnerships that society politely ignored. So long as no one talked too loudly about what was really going on, they carved out space in a world that wanted to shrink them down to fit inside a parlour chair. One such woman was Florence Nightingale. Though often romanticised as a saintly nurse, she was deeply critical of marriage and fiercely independent. She once wrote, "Why have women passion, intellect, moral activity, these three, and a place in society where no one of the three can be exercised?" That wasn't just a personal reflection. It was a full-throated rebellion against a system that told women their minds would rot without a husband. Quirky side note, Hysteria belts were briefly sold as medical aids for unmarried women. They were meant to stabilise the pelvis and prevent imaginary symptoms like uterine wandering or involuntary stimulation. Basically, they were purity belts with a doctor's approval. And if that doesn't give you the ick, congratulations, you're either a time traveller or a Victorian-era moralist. So tonight, as you lie in bed, single, partnered, it doesn't matter. Know that you are not a half-formed creature. Your sanity is not determined by a wedding ring or the lack thereof. Your thoughts, desires, and choices don't need anyone's medical validation. And if some ghostly Victorian doctor starts whispering about how your womb is crying from loneliness, just roll over, pull up the blanket, and tell him to take his wandering uterus theory and float it elsewhere. Because madness was never about women being single. It was about the world losing its mind whenever women dared to be whole. Black dress, black veil, black gloves, black everything for 2 full years. That's the kind of fashion commitment Victorian widows were expected to make after losing a husband. But this wasn't just about grief. This was ritualised mourning turned superstition-fueled performance. And for women's, it came with rules so rigid they made corsetry look like casual wear. You weren't just mourning your husband. You were publicly proving that you still belonged to him, even in death. Because in the Victorian world, widowhood wasn't freedom, it was a trap lined with crepe, superstition, and endless side-eyes from society. Let's set the scene. Your husband dies. The mourning clock starts immediately. You are now expected to enter deep mourning, a full year and a day where you wear only matte black, avoid social events, and absolutely do not smile in public. Not even at children, not even at puppies. You should look as though joy itself has been scrubbed from your soul. Laughter is suspicious, bright colours are treason. And heaven forbid you're caught humming a tune, you might as well announce you pushed him down the stairs. And here's where superstition slithers in. It wasn't just social pressure. People genuinely believed that breaking mourning protocols could invite death back into your home. If a widow showed signs of inappropriate cheer too soon, it was said to anger the spirits, or worse, confuse them. One persistent belief held that if you smiled too early, your late husband's ghost might think you'd forgotten him and come back to remind you. So if you suddenly felt a chill at night or found your candles blowing out for no reason, maybe it was your own fault for wearing lavender before your mourning period was up. There were rules for everything. You couldn't go to balls, you couldn't attend church socials, you had to write your thank you notes on special black-edged stationery with ink that didn't look too hopeful. Even your jewellery had to be sad, black jet usually, or mourning brooches that contained a lock of the dead husband's hair. Imagine being expected to accessorise your grief with a literal piece of your spouse. Forget diamonds. The hottest trend was a brooch that whispered, "I cry myself to sleep." Once the first year passed, you entered half mourning. That meant you could finally wear grey, lilac or mauve, colours that looked like black had faded in the wash. This was not a sign of healing. It was simply the next stage in the grand theatre of sorrow. And if you moved through these phases too quickly, neighbours would talk, because behind every drawn curtain was someone waiting to pounce on a misstep. Mourning was not just grief, it was public morality. There's one story that's equal parts sad and absurd. A woman in Leeds who wore navy instead of black during her mourning year was shunned by her entire church group. When asked, she explained her black dress had burned in a fire. No matter. The group said she should have stayed home rather than risk offending the dead. That was the superstition. Grief was sacred, and visible joy, intentional or not, was seen as an insult to the beyond. The expectations were so extreme that some women literally wasted away under them. There were recorded cases of mourning sickness, a catch-all diagnosis for widows who became listless, malnourished or unresponsive. Modern historians suspect depression, obviously, but back then doctors often blamed it on spiritual imbalance, grief that hadn't been performed correctly, or spirits still lingering too close. One particularly haunted phrase from the period? She let the sorrow in too deeply, which translated said means she followed every rule and still unravelled. And let's be very clear, this was mostly a woman's burden. Men had mourning periods too, but shorter, simpler, less suffocating. A widower might wear a black armband for a few months, attend a few sad dinners, and then quietly remarry as housekeeper. Society usually nodded and moved on. A widow doing the same? Scandal. There was a deeply superstitious belief that if a woman remarried too quickly, her first husband's soul would become restless. He might haunt the second marriage, or, even more tragically, curse her new children. Quirky fact time, mourning attire became so elaborate that it spun off an entire fashion industry. There were shops dedicated to nothing but grief wear, mourning warehouses, where you could buy everything from black parasols to widow's caps. You could even rent mourning clothes if you were poor, just so you wouldn't draw spiritual suspicion by grieving incorrectly. Imagine being forced to rent a sadness costume because you couldn't afford the full-price misery package. And if you think this was all just stuffy tradition, think again. Spiritualists jumped right in. Séances with widows were common, especially in the early months of grief. Mediums often claimed the deceased husband had messages, but only if the widow was properly dressed and emotionally open. There were cases where a spirit supposedly refused to appear because the widow had attempted to attend a tea party. The horror. There's a fascinating scholarly debate over whether this culture of grief was empowering or imprisoning. Some argue that it gave widows a social script, a way to navigate devastating loss with structure and ritual. Others say it was just another method of control, wrapping women in metaphorical and literal layers of black lace to ensure they didn't step out of line. After all, a grieving woman wasn't expected to have opinions, or desires, or plans. She was supposed to mourn, quietly and beautifully, until society said she could stop. But stop when exactly? The timeline was vague and the judgment was eternal. Some widows never escaped the grip of mourning expectations, especially if they had money and social status. Others, particularly in rural areas, had no choice but to resume work and life before the veil even settled over their eyes. The double standard was always present. Wealth meant pressure to perform grief. Poverty meant pressure to ignore it. Tonight, as you lie in the gentle dark, think about what it would mean to carry sorrow as a public costume. To perform grief not just for yourself, but to satisfy the expectations of your neighbours, your church, your ghost husband. Every sigh, every skir, every colour analysed like a litmus test for your soul. Imagine the weight of that. Now imagine shedding it, and choosing your own way to mourn, or not. That more than anything might have been the true Victorian rebellion. You're lounging, well, trying to, despite the corset and 36 buttons, on a velvet chaise in your aunt's drawing room. The tea is weak, the conversation weaker, and then someone sighs dramatically and says, "Oh, how delicate Mrs. Bloom has become. She swoons at the slightest distress." And instead of being worried, the entire room looks impressed. That's the twisted thing about the Victorian era. Fainting wasn't just normal, it was elegant. Welcome to the age of the swoon, where the act of losing consciousness became a status symbol, and being barely functional was a form of female virtue. Let's be clear, women didn't faint because it was fashionable. They fainted because they were trussed up in whalebone cages, emotionally starved, underfed, and constantly navigating social landmines. But Victorian society took that very real physical response and wrapped it in layers of mystique. A fainting woman wasn't weak. She was refined, overwrought, sensitive, too pure for the world. It became part of the ideal feminine image: porcelain skin, trembling hands, a fluttery pulse, and the ever-present risk of keeling over. There were rules, of course. You couldn't just faint anywhere. The drawing room? Acceptable. A poetry recital? Romantic. A political debate? Risky. But it could work if you fainted at the right moment, preferably after someone mentioned Darwin. Fainting at the market? Not classy, in the middle of the street, downright vulgar. Timing and setting mattered. You needed an audience, you needed the right lighting, and ideally a man nearby to catch you, preferably one with a stable income and a decent moustache. Enter the fainting couch, an actual piece of furniture designed for women to collapse gracefully upon. They were curved, plush, low-backed, and always within reach. It was assumed that women might spontaneously lose consciousness at any moment, so every respectable home needed a designated swoon zone. Imagine designing your living room around the expectation that you or your guests might hit the floor like Georgian dominoes. That was the vibe. Now, part of this was genuinely physiological. Women's clothing restricted breathing and movement so severely that fainting became common. Layers of petticoats, corsets cinched tight enough to alter your ribcage, high collars pressing against arteries. It's amazing anyone stayed upright. But instead of seeing this as a health issue, society romanticised it. A woman with robust lungs and good posture? Suspicious, possibly dangerous. One article warned that over-hearty women lacked moral sensitivity. Translation: if you didn't swoon, you probably had opinions and were therefore a problem. And of course, the upper classes led the way. The more fragile you appeared, the more elite you were presumed to be. Working-class women couldn't afford to faint. They had jobs, chores, children clinging to them, and not a fainting couch in sight. So the culture of swooning became another way to draw lines between women. The delicate ones, and the durable ones. The first were prized, painted, and praised. The second were ignored or criticised, and all of it was soaked in superstition. One fringe belief even claimed that frequent fainting was a sign of spiritual receptivity, that you were momentarily caught between this world and the next. Mediums, in particular, were known for fainting under pressure, and it was often interpreted as contact with spirits. So in some circles, a faint wasn't just a health blip, it was a message from beyond, or at least an excellent way to get out of an awkward dinner conversation. Meanwhile, Victorian medicine kept inventing reasons for why women fainted, and most of them were wrong. Some doctors claimed women's nervous systems were inherently weaker, while others believed fainting was the body's way of expelling excess emotion. One guidebook for young ladies advised avoiding overstimulating environments like opera houses, art galleries, and heated conversation and battle politics. Apparently, women's brains were so delicate they could be short-circuited by a well-composed aria. Quirky fact: there were actual fainting salts sold in pharmacies, little vials filled with ammonium carbonate that women carried in their purses. The idea was that a sharp sniff would jolt you back from unconsciousness, or at least restore your ability to pretend nothing embarrassing had just happened. Some of the more fashionable fainting salts came in decorative bottles shaped like flowers or cherubs, because if you're going to collapse from patriarchal pressure, you might as well do it with flair. Now, not everyone swooned because of tight clothing or spiritual contact. Some did it strategically. Want to avoid a dance with a particularly damp-handed suitor? Faint. Want to leave a party early without offending the host? Faint. Need to shut down a nosy aunt grilling you about marriage? Swoon dramatically into a potted plant. It was Victorian passive resistance at its most theatrical, but beneath the theatrics was something darker. Women's bodies were seen as unstable, over-emotional, and unreliable. A fainting woman was pitied, coddled, admired, but also dismissed. Her opinions didn't count. Her protests didn't register. Because if you're not even capable of staying conscious, how can you be trusted with anything else? The faint became both a symbol of virtue and a weapon of silencing. There's a scholarly debate about whether swooning was a form of power or submission. Some historians argue that it gave women a strange kind of leverage, a moment to reclaim space, stop a conversation, demand attention. Others see it as another tool of suppression, training women to see their own fragility as noble. Maybe it was both. Maybe women took the only tool they were given and used it however they could. Sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically, sometimes both. Even the language around fainting carried weight. To swoon was soft, romantic, and feminine. To pass out was something rough and medical, reserved for men after too much brandy. Words mattered. The illusion had to be maintained. Tonight, as you stretch out comfortably in your own bed, no corset, no expectations, you might want to take a deep breath just because you can. No one's going to faint if you have an opinion. No one's going to suggest your uterus is malfunctioning because you didn't collapse at a sunset. And if you do get lightheaded, it's probably not because your soul brushed against the ether. It's just time for a snack. But remember those women who were trained to fall down because standing up wasn't allowed. Who learned that softness was survival. That silence, delicacy, and a well-timed swoon could save them from worse. It wasn't drama, it was defense, and somehow it was still called grace. You're rifling through your modest Victorian wardrobe, mostly greys, a few faded blues, the ever-reliable funeral black, and your fingers pause on something scandalous, a red dress, not fire engine red even, just a deep wine-coloured satin. You know better, of course. Everyone knows what red means, passion, defence, maybe even sin, but something about it draws you in. Imagine wearing it to dinner, or more provocatively to church. And just like that, you're flirting with social annihilation. Because in the Victorian world, red wasn't just a colour, it was a curse, a superstition, a symbol so potent it could unravel your reputation before the hem even touched the floor. There was a deep-rooted belief that red, particularly when worn by a woman, was an outward sign of inner depravity. You could be the most God-fearing lady in your neighbourhood, but if you wore a crimson sash, people started whispering. And if you wore an actual red dress, full length, maybe satin or silk, you weren't just making a bold-fashioned choice. You were declaring war on propriety, or worse, announcing you had nothing left to lose. The connection between women and the colour red has a long and tangled history, much of it steeped in superstition. Red was associated with blood, of course, birth, menstruation, death, all things the Victorians preferred to pretend didn't exist. It also symbolised sexuality, which was supposed to be invisible until marriage and non-existent afterward. And then there was the religious angle. Red had biblical baggage. The whore of Babylon wore scarlet. Mary Magdalene was often painted in red. Lucifer himself, if you read the wrong preacher's pamphlet, might appear in a red cloak. So naturally, wearing red was like painting a target on your back that said, temptress, unclean, possibly demonic. This didn't stop women from wearing it, it just made doing so an act of calculated rebellion. Red was for actresses, courtesans, or the occasional widow who decided mourning was over and life was back on the menu. A red dress at a dinner party could cause actual gasps. In certain social circles, it was assumed that only a woman with a history would dare to wear it. If you had a reputation, red confirmed it. If you didn't, red created one. There's a famous story told in hushed tones in drawing rooms from Bath to Brighton of a young woman who wore a ruby-coloured gown to a charity ball. Her family insisted it was burgundy. The town insisted otherwise. She was uninvited from every subsequent social event for a year. Her mother took to her bed with shame, and her fiancé broke off the engagement, citing, moral incompatibility. The dress? Allegedly burned. Because sometimes the only way to save your soul was to incinerate your wardrobe. But why so much fear around colour? Well, Victorians believed deeply in visual symbolism. Colour wasn't decoration, it was declaration. Just like flowers carried secret messages, red roses for love, lilies for death. Clothing colours were thought to reflect inner character. Pale shades were associated with purity, pastels with youth and docility, earth tones with humility. Red, on the other hand, was associated with lust, rage, and uncontrollable femininity. It was the colour of fire, and no one trusted a woman who might spontaneously combust. Fashion magazines of the time didn't help. Publications like The Queen or the English Woman's Domestic Magazine warned against vulgar hues, often cautioning young ladies to stick with safe, unobtrusive shades. Some editors argued that red harmed the complexion, but everyone knew what they really meant. Red made a woman too visible, and visible women were dangerous. Theatrical costuming reinforced the fear. On stage, the villainess often wore red, usually paired with heavy eyeliner and a sneer. Red marked her as passionate, proud, and ultimately doomed. Meanwhile, the heroine wore white or blue, so even in fictional settings, the red dress became a shorthand for moral compromise. It was visual foreshadowing. She's trouble, she's doomed, and she probably reads French novels. Quirky fact, some superstitions extended to fabric dye. It was believed that red dye, particularly those derived from cochineal insects or mercury-based formulas, could infect the wearer with emotional agitation. One urban legend insisted that women who wore red too often became irritable, difficult to control, or possessed of dark moods. Naturally, this was blamed on the dye, not on the crushing weight of being a woman in 19th century society. But still, the myth persisted. There were even women who refused to store red clothing near their white blouses, fearing the moral contamination might spread. And if you were caught in red during a vulnerable moment, say speaking too passionately at a gathering or refusing a dance partner, your attire became Exhibit A. The superstition wasn't just that red reflected inner sin, it was that it caused it. Wearing red made you act differently. It emboldened, it tempted, it drew the eye of men and the judgment of women. You didn't just wear red wore you. There's an open academic debate over whether women used red as a conscious act of rebellion or if they were simply caught between trends and expectations. Some fashion historians argue that red dresses became a kind of feminist cipher, an unspoken signal to other women that you weren't playing by the usual rules. Others believe the superstition was so strong that only the most socially fearless, or already disgraced, dared to wear it. Either way, red was never neutral, and yet the power of red lingered. Even those who feared it were drawn to it. Paintings from the era show women in muted rooms, surrounded by beige and grey with a single splash of red ribbon or flower pinned at the collar. It's as though they wanted to rebel just enough to hint at fire without lighting the match. A red detail said, "I know what I'm supposed to be, but I also know what I am." So tonight, as you relax under your own blankets, maybe wearing red pyjamas without a second thought, take a moment to appreciate that freedom. No one's whispering behind your back. No one's wondering what your dress says about your virtue. And no one is about to write to your clergyman because you wore a crimson hairpin. But remember those women who buttoned themselves into forbidden silk, knowing full well the risk, who turned heads and paid for it with gossip, who chose to be seen in a world that preferred its women invisible. Red wasn't just colour, it was courage. You glance at the mirror across the room just for a second, really, but if this were Victorian England and the clock had just struck midnight, you might have just invited the devil himself into your bedroom. That was the superstition. Mirrors weren't simply pieces of reflective glass, they were portals, and after dark they became downright sinister. In the soft flicker of gaslight or candlelight, Victorians believed a mirror could do much more than show your reflection. It could reflect your soul, trap your spirit, or, if you were especially unlucky, summon something that wasn't you at all. The Victorian obsession with mirrors wasn't purely aesthetic. Sure, they loved a gilded frame and some ornate carving, but beneath all that ornamentation was fear. At night, mirrors were often covered with cloth, particularly in bedrooms, not because of modesty, but because of superstition. The prevailing belief was that mirrors became dangerous when the sun went down, that moonlight or candlelight could activate something within them, make them receptive like antennae tuned to the wrong channel, and once they were open, anything could look back. One common belief held that if a woman looked into a mirror after midnight, she might see her true self, not her physical reflection. but her inner character. That might sound poetic, but in Victorian terms, it was terrifying. If you were pure and devout, you'd supposedly see a soft glow or an angelic aura. But if you were sinful, if you'd thought about a man you weren't married to, skipped church, or worn a scandalous ribbon, your reflection might shift, smirk, or vanish entirely. Or worse, you might see someone else's face in the glass, staring out from your own body, and naturally, the most cursed time to catch your reflection was while brushing your hair. You, alone, candle-lit, vulnerable, running a brush through those moral strands of hair. Remember, hair is a whole thing. And then you look up, and there's something wrong. Maybe your eyes aren't quite your own. Maybe your smile is a little crooked. The superstition was so strong that some etiquette books advised women not to keep mirrors near the bed, for fear of catching a distorted glimpse of themselves in a moment of emotional weakness. You could literally reflect madness. This fear intensified during mourning. A strict and eerie superstition demanded that all mirrors be covered in a house where someone had recently died. The rationale? If the spirit of the dead lingered, a mirror could trap it, or worse, offer it a way back in. There are first-hand accounts of people waking in the night to see faces in the glass after the death of a loved one. Of course, they were probably seeing their own grief-stricken expressions in the dark, but in a world where science and the supernatural were locked in a constant, exhausting waltz, the explanation didn't matter. The fear was real. There's a chilling little anecdote from 1871. A woman in Kent was found staring into her mirror for hours after her sister died. When finally coaxed away, she claimed her sister was speaking through the glass. She refused to let anyone cover it, convinced that to do so would sever the connection. Eventually, neighbours intervened and removed the mirror. The woman became catatonic for weeks. Was it grief, delusion, or had superstition created a feedback loop so strong it trapped her in her own reflection? Even parlour games had a dark edge. One popular darer involved staring into a mirror at midnight by candlelight and reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. If you were brave enough to complete it, you'd supposedly see your future husband or your death appear behind you. This wasn't for laughs. It was whispered about like a test of courage and morality, and those who tried it were often shaken, convinced they'd seen something they shouldn't have. The mirror was more than glass. It was a test, a trap, a truth-teller. Quirky fact: some women were advised not to polish their mirrors too often. Why? Because overly clear mirrors were believed to tempt vanity and invite mischief. A little blur, a little distortion, was considered safer. It was thought that spirits couldn't travel through tarnished surfaces as easily. That little smudge you might rub away today with a microfiber cloth, that was once spiritual armour. And mirrors weren't just feared at night. They were also considered dangerous for women during menstruation, pregnancy, or emotional distress, times when their souls were supposedly unsettled. A woman crying in front of a mirror might accidentally imprint her sorrow into the glass, creating what some called a shadow twin, a psychic echo that could reappear months or years later. There were reports, particularly in spiritualist circles, of women claiming to see younger versions of themselves staring out from antique mirrors. Time, sorrow, and superstition all layered into a haunted reflection of what once was. There's a lively scholarly debate about whether these mirror superstitions were metaphors for identity, how women were expected to see themselves through the eyes of others, or literal fears driven by spiritualism and grief culture. Likely it was both. Victorian women lived in a hall of mirrors, constantly reflecting the expectations, judgments, and myths placed upon them. The mirror was just one more surface reminding them who they were supposed to be, and punishing them if they looked too long or too honestly. Some writers of the time even used mirrors as moral devices. In Gothic literature, a mirror often signalled a turning point, a moment when the heroine glimpsed something terrifying about herself or her fate. The reflection became prophecy. A woman who defied convention might see herself dissolve. A woman consumed by desire might watch her features twist. The mirror didn't lie, it just revealed what no one was brave enough to say aloud. Tonight, as you pass your own mirror, maybe catching a harmless glance of yourself brushing your teeth or pulling on your favourite sweatshirt, know that no spirits are waiting. No trapped souls, no shadow twins, no judgment hiding behind the silvered glass. Just you, as you are. But maybe, just maybe, next time you find yourself alone with a mirror past midnight, you'll pause, just for a second, and wonder, like the women before you, If I look too long, what will look back? You reach for something with your left hand, maybe your phone, maybe a cup of tea, and think nothing of it. But if this were 19th century England, someone might have gasped, not because you spilled anything, but because you dared to lead with your sinister side. That's right. In the eyes of Victorian superstition, being left-handed wasn't quirky or mildly inconvenient. It was dangerous, ominous, possibly demonic. Because in a society already obsessed with order, manners, and strict binaries, the left hand wasn't just the other one. It was a threat. The roots of this fear go way back, of course. The Latin word for left is sinistra, which is where we get sinister. The right hand was associated with strength, virtue, blessing. The left hand, deceit, weakness, sorcery. And the Victorians, ever the enthusiasts of inherited paranoia, clung to this like a corset hook. Left-handedness was treated as a flaw to be corrected, a defect of character. If a young girl reached for a quill with her left, it wasn't cute. It was something to be fixed, immediately. Parents, teachers, and even doctors got involved. There were special straps designed to tie the left hand down during school hours, forcing girls to write with their right. Gloves were sometimes sewn shut on the left side so it couldn't be used at all. In more aggressive cases, left hands were wrapped with rulers, scalded with hot water, or simply labelled as the devil's paw, and this wasn't rare, it was common practice. The goal was simple: erase the left, reinforce the right. Girls were told that using their left hand could make them clumsy, unattractive, or, worst of all, unmarriageable. Superstitions abounded. A left-handed bride would bring bad luck to her household. A woman who offered her left hand to shake or serve tea might accidentally curse the guest. And don't even think about blessing someone or crossing yourself with your left. It was seen as a spiritual insult. Left was not just wrong. It was wrongness embodied. The fear even extended to physical appearance. A woman who favoured her left hand might develop uneven posture, which was deeply offensive to Victorian beauty standards. Proper women were symmetrical. They were graceful. They leaned right in more ways than one. Left-handedness disrupted that ideal. It was associated with mental imbalance, moral confusion, even secret vice. If you couldn't follow the rules of handedness, what other rules were you capable of breaking? And this wasn't just idle gossip. In spiritualist circles, left-handed women were often viewed with suspicion. Mediums who used their left hand during trance writing or spirit communication were sometimes accused of channeling dark forces. There was a belief that evil spirits preferred the left side of the body, entering through the left ear, nestling in the left palm, speaking through the left eye. A left-handed female medium, she was either incredibly gifted or deeply possessed, or both. One particularly bizarre belief claimed that ambidextrous women were the most dangerous of all. If you could use both hands equally, you might have a divided soul, or an untamed duality that threatened the natural order. Women weren't supposed to be complex, remember? They were supposed to be predictable, pure right-handed. Quirky fact, there was a whole cottage industry of products designed to train the left out of girls. Left-hand correction pens, needlework kits that forced the right hand to dominate, even prayer books with layouts that discouraged the left hand from touching the sacred pages. All of it wrapped in soft pinks and florals, of course, because nothing says psychological conditioning like a daisy print. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these efforts were about health, order, or control. Some historians argue that left-handedness was merely a convenient target, an easy-to-identify trait that allowed institutions to assert dominance early in a child's life. Others suggest that it was less about the hand itself and more about what it symbolised: deviation. And in Victorian society, deviation in girls was dangerous. If you could write with your left, maybe you'd start asking questions, maybe you'd speak out of turn, maybe you'd want to vote someday. Better to stop the whole business at the wrist. But of course, left-handed women didn't disappear. Some learned to hide it, switching hands in public and quietly reverting when alone. Others never managed to change and bore the scars, physical, emotional, or both. There are diary entries from women describing the shame of being crooked or against ad. Some prayed for correction, others leaned into the identity, seeing their difference as defiance, even if they never said it aloud. And the prejudice lingered. Into adulthood, left-handed women were viewed as slightly suspect. They were more likely to be labelled eccentric, difficult, or unreliable. One etiquette guide even warned that a left-handed woman may prove disloyal in sheer marriage, as if her penmanship predicted adultery. Because obviously, if you pour tea with the wrong hand, what's next? Scandal? Treason? And yet, some of the most brilliant women of the era were left-handed. Artists, writers, scientists. Their work may not have mentioned it, but the marks are there. Brushstrokes that favoured the opposite direction. Signatures angled slightly to the left. Tiny rebellions hidden in plain sight. And while no one celebrated them then, we can honour them now for doing the forbidden with grace. Tonight, if you catch yourself reaching for your blanket with your left hand, know that you would have been considered suspect, maybe even a little cursed in another time. But also know this, you'd be part of a long, quiet resistance. Women who wrote, stitched, painted, and poured tea with the hand they weren't supposed to, who refused to be corrected, who carried superstition on their knuckles and kept going anyway. So go ahead, lead with your left. It's not sinister. It's strength. You've been hearing whispers, haven't you? Not the wind outside your window, but the faint, eerie suggestion that the wallpaper itself might be listening. In Victorian England, nervousness and solitary confinement weren't just medical terms. They were invitations to superstition. Ladies who spent too much time alone in their rooms were warned that the walls could harbour spirits, bad luck, or even moral corruption. The wallpaper was more than decoration. It was a potential accomplice, a psychic witness, and sometimes, in the minds of the paranoid, subtle tormentor. The fear wasn't entirely baseless, at least not in their imagination. Victorian houses were often drafty, full of creaks and groans, with wallpaper that would peel and bubble in damp conditions. Strange stains could resemble faces or hands. Shadows danced in candlelight. If you were already worried about your nerves or trapped in a prolonged period of domestic solitude, these small irregularities were interpreted as active messages. A stain became a warning, a tear in the power, a malicious handprint. And the longer you stared, the more your imagination, or your hysteria, filled in the gaps. The connection between nerves, solitude, and superstition was formalised in the medical literature of the time. Doctors argued that women who spent too much time alone, especially young unmarried women, developed overactive imaginations that made them prone to nervous disorders. The walls, with their patterns and textures, were seen as potential triggers. A repeating floral motif could stir melancholy. A geometric pattern might excite the sexual organs. Yes, the Victorian brain could turn wallpaper into a moral and physical threat. Reading while lying on a patterned rug? Another risk. Sitting next to the fireplace with a brocade couch? Heaven help you. One particularly famous example, immortalised in literature, is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. In it, a woman confined to her room by her physician husband slowly descends into obsession with the paper itself, eventually believing she sees a trapped figure moving behind it. The story is often cited as one of the first critiques of the medical mistreatment of women, but it also demonstrates just how pervasive the superstition was. Walls weren't neutral. They were agents of control, mirrors of one's mental state, and sometimes conspirators in your undoing. Quirky fact, some Victorian manuals recommended facing away from patterned wallpaper during illness, or even covering it with plain cloth to prevent agitation. Others suggested that certain colours could soothe the nerves, pale blues or greens, and that leaving the wallpaper exposed could invite spiritual intrusion. In extreme cases, households removed all patterned surfaces, creating austere rooms that were almost jail-like, all in the name of protecting a woman's delicate constitution. The psychological impact was immense. Women already trapped in domestic routines, cut off from work, education, or meaningful social interaction, were now constantly reminded that their environment might be conspiring against them. If they felt anxious or melancholic, they were taught to believe the walls were responsible. If they hallucinated, the wallpaper became proof that something supernatural was at work. And if they protested or questioned the narrative, they were labelled as rebellious, hysterical, or worse, morally suspect. There was even a fringe belief that wallpaper could affect fertility. Some argued that highly patterned rooms, especially with repeated floral motifs, could overstimulate a woman's reproductive organs, leading to complications or delayed marriage prospects. The logic was that excessive visual input excited the nerves, which then transferred energy to the womb, a recurring theme in Victorian medical superstition. Women were literally told that their environment could interfere with their biology, and of course social isolation intensified the effect. Young women in boarding schools or widows living alone often found themselves obsessively studying patterns in walls, rugs and fabrics. Some journals record women meticulously sketching repeating patterns to understand the influence, almost as if conducting an early experiment in visual stimuli. Others refused to sit in rooms with wallpaper at all, covering walls with sheets or hanging tapestries for protection. What might seem obsessive today was, at the time, careful adherence to precaution. Historians debate whether these fears were purely cultural or whether they reflected genuine anxiety, exacerbated by confinement and social pressure. Many agree that it was a mixture. Superstition validated nervous disorders, which validated superstition. The feedback loop ensured that women internalized the belief that the domestic environment, already under male control, could further control their minds. The wallpaper was both a symbol and a tool, beautiful, ornate, and deadly if approached incorrectly. Tonight, as you relax under your own ceiling and gaze at the subtle textures of your bedroom walls, remember the women who once lived under patterned prisons. For them, every swirl of a floral motif could trigger fear, obsession, or despair. Every shadow on the wall might have been a warning, and yet some persisted, observing, questioning, surviving, quiet rebellions against a house that didn't just contain them, but attempted to define their very nerves. You glance down at your calendar and notice that it's that time of the month. In the modern world, this might just mean cramps, chocolate, and a brief permission slip to binge-watch in peace. But in Victorian England, menstruation wasn't a biological fact, it was a moral hazard. Periods were considered dangerous, unpredictable, and potentially evil. Women weren't just uncomfortable, they were susceptible to malevolence. Society believed that blood could summon spirits, trigger madness, or attract ill fortune. And if you weren't careful, your monthly cycle could be used as a measure of your morality. Doctors of the era were obsessed with regulating women's bodies, and menstruation was no exception. One particularly charming theory claimed that during menstruation, women's reproductive systems were temporarily open to external influences. This meant that spiritually they were more sensitive, but also more vulnerable. Bad spirits, negative energy, and even sexual temptation could slip in, particularly if a woman left the house or interacted with certain dangerous stimuli. Think of it as a moral Bermuda Triangle. The wrong action, the wrong emotion, and everything could go catastrophically wrong. And it was all tied to your uterus, of course. Some superstitions went further, asserting that menstruating women could spoil food, wilt flowers, or taint the household's general health. A mother might forbid a daughter from handling the kitchen during her period, claiming the blood could infect the bread or milk. Others believed menstruating women were prone to fits of hysteria, fainting, or violent temper, reinforcing the stereotype that female emotion was unstable and dangerous. These ideas were so widely accepted that entire households often treated menstruating women as slightly cursed, walking on eggshells around them. There were even prescribed rituals for safety. Women were advised to wear dark clothing, stay near home, and avoid mirrors to prevent attracting evil forces. Some sources recommended carrying charms, herbs, small stones, or protective jewellery to neutralise the supernatural effects of menstruation. If you were particularly devout, you might even recite prayers or meditate over a cup of warm water, all intended to safeguard both yourself and your family from unseen influence. Yes, your period was essentially a public hazard, unless carefully managed. Quirky fact: Victorian-era fortune tellers sometimes offered menstrual readings, claiming to predict your future health, emotional state, or romantic fortune based on the colour, flow, or timing of your period. One popular divination guide suggested that a heavy, bright red cycle foretold passion, while a light, pale flow indicated sadness or impending illness. Of course, this was all pseudoscience, but it reinforced the idea that menstruation was a supernatural, morally charged event, not a natural biological function. The fear extended to fertility as well. Women were cautioned that improper behaviour during menstruation could lead to miscarriage, infertility, or unhealthy offspring. Sex during menstruation, particularly, was considered both immoral and dangerous, an idea rooted in older European taboos that conflated blood with sin. Doctors warned that women who violated these taboos risked their health, their children, and their very souls. As always, the uterus was central to the moral and medical panic. Even clothing was implicated. Dark skirts and heavy undergarments were recommended to contain and manage dangerous energy, while tight corsets were said to help stabilize the body. Paradoxically, these garments, which already restricted movement and circulation, were promoted as protective rather than harmful. Women were trapped in a cycle. Their natural rhythms were dangerous, and the tools prescribed to manage them caused discomfort, weakness, and fatigue. It was superstition wrapped in domestic regulation, disguised as care. Historians continue to debate how these beliefs influenced women's daily lives. Some argue that it was a form of social control, framing natural processes as threats to morality and household stability. Others suggest it was genuinely internalized, with women learning to fear their own bodies and emotions. Either way, the psychological impact was profound. Menstruation became a marker of danger, instability, and moral scrutiny, a cycle of both biology and superstition. And yet, women endured. They navigated the restrictions, memorized the rules, and even found ways to assert quiet autonomy within them. Some used the period as an excuse for rest or private reflection. Others disguised rebellion as ritual compliance. Behind every dark skirt and protective charm was a mind quietly negotiating survival, curiosity, and desire in a world that sought to define both in rigid, fear-driven terms. Tonight, as you adjust your blankets, consider the invisible chains Victorian women bore each month. Their blood, natural and necessary, became the lens through which society measured their morality, virtue, and sanity. You, however, are free. No prayers, charms, or heavy skirts are required, and the only danger tonight is perhaps finishing your tea too late, or laughing too loudly at this bizarre history, both far safer than any superstition ever imagined. You roll over in bed, shivering slightly under your blanket, and it occurs to you, dreams, that strange, flickering landscape where your mind wanders while your body rests. In Victorian times, dreams weren't just idle amusements or glimpses into your subconscious. They were moral tests. Women were warned that impure thoughts, desires, or fantasies could manifest as nightmares sent directly by the devil. Nightmares weren't random. They were punishments, warnings, or moral indictments. And if you woke up in a cold sweat, society might quietly imply that your soul, or more specifically your uterus, was culpable. The Victorians took dreams seriously. For women, they were often tied to purity, sexuality, and spiritual integrity. Dreaming of romance, passion, or physical desire wasn't considered normal exploration of the imagination. It was a dangerous symptom. Sleep could be an arena for moral failure. One pamphlet from the 1880s advised mothers to ensure that their daughters' rooms were free of suggestive art, romantic novels, and even certain toys, all in the hope of warding off nocturnal temptations. And if the girl did have an impure dream, she was instructed to confess it or risk spiritual contamination. This wasn't just superstition, it had a medical angle too. Doctors suggested that vivid or unsettling dreams in women could exacerbate hysteria, disrupt digestion, and even interfere with reproductive health. The mind-body link was particularly applied to female sexuality. If a woman had erotic dreams, it wasn't just a moral lapse. It could supposedly strain the womb, unbalance her nerves, and trigger fainting spells. In short, even while asleep, women were expected to maintain virtue, decorum, and restraint. Some Victorian spiritualists offered a strange solution: dream journals. Women were encouraged to record dreams each morning, then analyse them for hidden sins or warnings. Patterns were supposed to reveal dangerous tendencies, desire, rebellion, or latent temperamental qualities. One fringe belief even held that recurring nightmares signalled a visit from evil spirits trying to exploit a woman's vulnerability. Recording, interpreting, and correcting these dreams was a nightly moral exercise, part vigilance, part superstition, and part anxiety-induced insomnia. Quirky fact, some guides suggested that sleeping with your head facing north could ward off bad dreams, while placing a mirror under your pillow might reflect evil spirits away from your mind. Others claimed that a sprig of lavender or rosemary tucked beneath the pillow could calm the uterus and prevent nocturnal arousal. You can imagine the awkwardness. A young woman, tossing in bed, clutching herbs, convinced her womb could attract demons mid-dream. It gets even stranger. Nightmares were often interpreted as omens regarding marriage, fertility, or death. A dream of losing teeth could signal childbirth complications. Dreaming of water might indicate menstrual imbalance. Seeing a man in a dream, especially if he was handsome, was considered highly dangerous and could threaten moral and physical stability. Women were trained to fear their own imaginations, to view the mind as a moral battleground, and to assume guilt simply for dreaming. There were also reports of shared moral dreams in which women in the same household might influence one another's sleep. If the eldest daughter dreamt of rebellion, it was thought that her younger sisters could be infected by the same visions. The idea of female mental contagion reinforced the necessity of supervision and control. Dreams weren't private, they were socially and spiritually monitored. Historians debate whether these dream-related superstitions reflected actual spiritual belief or were part of a broader attempt to control women's sexuality and autonomy. Some argue that women internalized the fear of their own imaginations, creating a culture of self-surveillance that extended from waking life into sleep. Others note that such superstitions provided structure for anxiety, giving women tools, however absurd, to manage internal chaos in a world that demanded compliance. Some women, however, resisted. They wrote freely in journals, sketched dream imagery, or shared their nocturnal adventures with trusted friends. These small acts of defiance allowed them to reclaim the private space of the mind from superstition. Others simply ignored the warnings entirely, choosing sleep as a place of respite rather than surveillance. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, know that your dreams are yours alone. They can wander, twist, and even terrify you without judgment. Unlike in the Victorian era, there's no moral ledger waiting to punish you for imagining a little romance, adventure, or rebellion. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll even dream of women who once navigated the same darkness, quietly defying the superstitions that tried to chain their minds, one nightmare at a time. You climb the attic stairs in your imagination, each creak of the wood echoing like a secret, and pause beneath the rafters. In the Victorian era, a woman who enjoyed mathematics, science, or even the company of mechanical contraptions could quickly become the subject of whispers. The attic, or any secluded study, was considered a hazardous playground for the female mind. Society believed that women who engaged with science were tempting fate, inviting supernatural misfortune, or risking moral corruption. In short, curiosity was suspect, and intellect was a liability. The suspicion wasn't limited to casual tinkering. Women who studied astronomy, dissected specimen, or experimented with chemistry were often labelled eccentric or worse, possessed. A woman taking an interest in natural philosophy was believed to be channeling forbidden knowledge, straying too far from her proper domestic sphere. There were accounts of families forbidding daughters from entering laboratories or libraries alone, under the belief that unchaperoned intellectual activity could excite the nerves, destabilise the womb, or attract malevolent spirits. A microscope was not just a tool, it was a potential portal to chaos. One particularly extreme belief warned that excessive scientific study could physically deform the body. Some doctors argued that intense concentration on numbers or experimentation caused uterine displacement, nervous weakness, or even blindness. Victorian medical texts frequently conflated mental exertion with reproductive vulnerability. The message was clear. If a woman dared to think too hard, especially about subjects deemed inappropriate, she risked both her body and her soul. Education, curiosity, and intellect were dangerous indulgences when not filtered through strict moral supervision. Quirky fact, some Victorian manuals suggested that women who engaged in scientific work should carry a protective herb sachet, rosemary, sage, or lavender on their person to ward off the destabilising effects of mental exertion. These herbs were believed to calm the nerves, balance the reproductive organs, and shield the practitioner from negative spiritual influence. Essentially, women were told that the mere act of thinking could summon misfortune unless neutralised by plants. The fear extended into social perception. A woman seen in public with a telescope or a set of mathematical instruments risked ridicule. She could be described as unnatural, unfeminine, or even bewitched. The stereotype of the obsessive scientist, malevolent, unmarried, socially isolated, was projected onto women who dared to engage with the material world. For Victorian society, curiosity was dangerous, especially when it belonged to someone expected to be compliant and ornamental. In some households, the attic itself became a forbidden zone, both literally and symbolically. It was where machinery hummed, where experiments fizzed, where women could theoretically tamper with knowledge that wasn't theirs. Parents worried that exposure to chemicals, lightning experiments, or even algebra might induce madness, hysteria, or sexual agitation. The attic was both a sanctuary and a trap, the site of discovery and the site of potential moral downfall. Historians debate whether these fears were purely patriarchal control or an extension of genuine concern for health. Some argue that Victorian medicine and superstition amplified normal anxiety about women's education, turning legitimate concern into exaggerated warnings. Others see it as a method of social policing, ensuring women remain domestic and decorative rather than analytical and self-directed. Either way, intellectual pursuits were pathologized for women, often turning curiosity into a moral or medical crime. Fringe beliefs added an additional layer of intrigue. Some spiritualists claimed that women who experimented with scientific apparatus could inadvertently open portals to spirits, allowing ghosts to enter their minds or bodies. Others suggested that the use of electricity, magnets, or lenses could amplify latent psychic abilities, producing visions, sleepwalking, or hysteria. Scientific engagement, in other words, wasn't just a cerebral act, it was a potential supernatural threat. Yet women persisted. Some secretly conducted experiments at home, documented findings, and even shared knowledge with other women, carefully navigating societal scrutiny. These intellectual rebels learned to disguise curiosity under domestic necessity or aesthetic pursuits, measuring angles for embroidery patterns, studying light for painting, or observing plants for household remedies. Their ingenuity allowed them to cultivate knowledge in a world that insisted curiosity was dangerous. Tonight, as you imagine yourself peering at constellations, tweaking an engine, or scribbling in a notebook, remember the women who risked censure, superstition, and moral panic to do the same. Their laboratories were often attics, closets, and hidden parlours, their instruments disguised as domestic tools, and though Victorian society warned them that science would unmoor their minds and bodies, they persisted quietly, proving that curiosity, no matter how forbidden, was a subtle, defiant form of power. You've probably heard someone throw around the term blue stocking before, maybe as a casual insult. In Victorian England, though, it wasn't a joke. It was a label of suspicion, social condemnation, and whispered alarm. A blue stocking was a woman who read too much, spoke too freely, or dared to exhibit intellectual curiosity. She was educated, opinionated, and, horror of horrors, not entirely concerned with marriage. And in a society where women's primary purpose was considered ornamental and reproductive, that was dangerous, very dangerous. The term originated earlier in the 18th century, describing informal gatherings of intellectual women who wore blue worsted stockings instead of the more fashionable silk. By the Victorian era, it had morphed into a shorthand for a woman who transgressed societal norms by prioritising her mind over her body, or at least over male approval. Being called a blue stocking wasn't a compliment. It implied a deficiency of charm, warmth, or virtue, and a surfeit of ambition or intellect. Essentially, it was an early form of social shaming. If you dared to think, society had a label waiting for you. Blue stockings were seen as unnatural, almost suspect in the eyes of contemporary moralists. Some feared they would inspire other women to abandon domestic duties or, worse, develop what doctors termed nervous conditions from mental exertion. There were whispered warnings that too much reading, discussion, or independent thought could affect reproductive health, weaken the body, or even make a woman infertile. The educated woman's brain, in other words, was considered a physical threat to her own anatomy. Quirky fact, some manuals suggested that blue stockings should limit their reading of serious philosophical works, particularly those by French or German authors. Why? Because foreign ideas might overexcite their nerves, cause insomnia, or invite improper thoughts. Even reading literature in moderation was fraught with peril. The act of intellectual engagement became morally and physically risky, a societal loophole for controlling female behaviour. The fear of educated women extended beyond books. Blue stockings were often portrayed as domineering, unattractive, or socially isolating. They could be spinsters, teachers, writers, or simply women with a voracious appetite for learning. One guide warned that such women cannot be trusted in the drawing room, implying that intellect was incompatible with charm and obedience. The lesson was clear. A mind that wandered was a threat to social stability. Victorian literature frequently reflected this anxiety. Characters labelled as blue stockings were depicted as tragic, eccentric, or morally ambiguous. They might be brilliant, but their intellect was framed as dangerous and unattractive. Novels warned young women that ambition and curiosity must be balanced with domestic duties, or else ruin, social, moral, or emotional, would inevitably follow. Education was tolerated only when carefully contained, yet the label didn't always succeed in suppressing talent. Many women embraced the identity quietly, cultivating knowledge and intellectual friendships in private. Correspondence, clandestine study groups, and literary societies provided spaces where women could read, debate, and write without attracting immediate censure. In some cases, the blue stocking became a badge of subtle defiance, a quiet intellectual rebellion against the suffocating expectations of the drawing room. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the blue stocking stereotype was more a reflection of male anxiety than female reality. Some historians argue that it was a deliberate tool to stigmatise women who refused to adhere to strictly domestic roles. Others suggest that society's fascination with and fear of these women paradoxically helped elevate their influence, even as they were criticised. Either way, the tension between intellect and acceptability defined the lives of many Victorian women. Tonight, as you think about the women who loved learning, ponder their quiet rebellion. They weren't fainting, mourning, or swooning, they were thinking. Their ideas were threatening precisely because they were uncontrolled, uncontained, and unapologetically alive. And while the world might have called them blue stockings, they wore their curiosity like a hidden crown, threading resistance into every whispered conversation, every private note, and every carefully hidden page. You wake in the night, startled by the creak of the floorboards, or perhaps your own imagination, and find yourself wandering literally through your dreams and the shadows of your room. Victorian society had a peculiar obsession with sleepwalking or somnambulism, particularly in women. It wasn't just seen as a medical curiosity. It was interpreted as a moral and sexual warning. A woman who walked in her sleep might be considered dangerous, unchaste, or even possessed by unseen forces. Sleepwalking was no longer merely a nighttime oddity. It became a reflection of her inner instability. Doctors and moralists alike viewed somnambulism as a symptom of excessive nerves, hysteria, or repressed sexuality. If a woman exhibited sleepwalking tendencies, it wasn't just a harmless quirk. It indicated that her body and mind were out of alignment. Some physicians suggested that such women were on the verge of insanity, that wandering without conscious control revealed latent depravity, or that their sexual energy had nowhere to go, thus manifesting in unconscious movement. Essentially, your legs could betray your virtue while you were blissfully unaware. In the Victorian imagination, sleepwalking could also be dangerously literal. Newspapers and case studies reported women wandering out of windows, into streets, or even near water, with the potential for injury or moral scandal. The act of leaving the house in one's nightdress, unattended, was interpreted not as accident or curiosity, but as evidence of susceptibility to sexual or supernatural temptation. A woman could be a victim of circumstance, and yet the blame landed squarely on her own body and its supposed instability. Quirky fact: some doctors prescribe the wearing of belts or other restraints at night to prevent sleepwalking. These devices were often framed as protective measures for both the woman and her family, designed to anchor her physically and morally. Some even recommended placing a guardian in the room to watch over the sleepwalker, as if vigilance could control unconscious desire. The line between care and surveillance blurred completely. Victorian literature often dramatised sleepwalking as both a symbol and a cautionary tale. In novels and plays, the somnambulist female protagonist might wander through dangerous landscapes, symbolising the threat of unchaperoned desire or unchecked emotion. She could be saved only by a virtuous male figure or the intervention of rigid social norms. The narrative always reinforced the idea that women were safest and most moral when constrained, supervised, and predictably contained. Sleepwalking was also tied to superstition about nocturnal forces. Some spiritualists claimed that women in a state of somnambulism could communicate with spirits, receive messages from beyond, or attract malevolent entities. While this framed sleepwalking as potentially mystical, it also heightened the fear that women's unconscious actions were inherently risky. Their bodies were porous vessels, their minds open to unseen influence, and their movements could be both threatening and morally suspect. Historical debate continues regarding whether Victorian concerns about sleepwalking reflected genuine medical opposition or were primarily a mechanism of social control. Some scholars argue that the phenomenon was exaggerated to reinforce patriarchal norms. Women's independence, even unconscious, was dangerous and needed supervision. Others suggest that medical and moral anxiety about sleepwalking intersected, producing a narrative in which women's minds and bodies were constantly monitored for deviation, real or imagined. Despite the risks, some women managed to navigate the stigma. Diaries and letters from the era reveal attempts to normalise or quietly manage nocturnal wandering. Some families instituted strict nightly routines, turning the household itself into a system of surveillance. Others developed creative solutions like padding floorboards or placing harmless objects in hallways to prevent injury. In each case, women were forced to negotiate safety, morality and autonomy simultaneously, often in silence. Tonight, as you adjust in your bed and feel the soft pull of blankets around you, think of the women who walked unknowingly through the night, bodies in motion while society watched, judged, and interpreted every step. Sleepwalking wasn't harmless, it was a marker, a warning, a narrative imposed on the body of every woman who dared to move freely, even unconsciously, and yet they survived, stepped lightly, and claimed their mornings, even if the night belonged to superstition. You glance down at your feet, shoes, socks, slippers, and something as simple as the choice of heels suddenly seems laden with consequence. In Victorian times, footwear wasn't just fashion, it was morality, superstition, and social judgment all rolled into one. Women's shoes were said to influence posture, circulation, virtue, and even fate. High heels, for example, were considered both alluring and dangerous, capable of disrupting a woman's physical and moral balance if worn improperly. In short, what touched the ground beneath a woman could touch her destiny as well. The obsession with shoes was tied to broader concerns about women's bodies. A heel that was too high might exacerbate fainting, strain the spine or interfere with reproductive organs, problems framed as both medical and moral. Shoes weren't neutral objects, they could literally dictate the health of your uterus and nerves. Some manuals even warned that improper footwear could lead to moral laxity, suggesting that a woman's gait influenced her behaviour. Walk too confidently and you might inspire envy or temptation. Shuffle too awkwardly and you might invite pity or derision. Certain shoes were considered outright dangerous. Slippers or soft-soled footwear were sometimes said to make women slip into immorality, while sharp-pointed heels were accused of agitating the passions of onlookers. There were suggestions that men could be physically or spiritually tempted by the sight of exposed feet in certain contexts. The act of dressing was therefore not just aesthetic but protective. Shoes could guard or betray. Quirky fact, some Victorian advice books recommended padding or special inserts for shoes to correct moral imbalance caused by improper posture. Heels could be slightly adjusted to stabilise nerves or temper volatile energies. There were even reports of women wearing differently shaped shoes for ceremonial or medicinal purposes, as if the ground itself had a psychic influence on their inner lives. Your soles weren't just soles, they were conduits of propriety. Footwear also carried social messages. Walking with poise and proper shoes signalled obedience, refinement and control. Missteps could lead to whispers about character or hints of sexual impropriety. A clumsy woman might be labelled foolish or overly emotional. A woman who chose practical, sturdy boots over dainty heels might be accused of abandoning feminine grace. There was no winning. Your shoes were both literal and symbolic extensions of your virtue, or lack thereof. The connection between shoes and superstition extended beyond posture and moral influence. Certain shoe colours and materials were believed to affect luck, fertility, or health. Red shoes, for instance, could enhance passion, but also attract moral judgment, much like red dresses. Black shoes were deemed safe, stabilising and socially acceptable. White shoes, especially for young women, symbolised purity, but were perilous if dirtied, reflecting moral stain. Shoes were a daily moral calculation, a silent litmus test performed with each step. Historians debate whether these beliefs were rooted in genuine concern for physical health, or were mostly a tool of social control. Many suggest that caution around footwear reinforced class and gender hierarchies, subtly enforcing the idea that women's bodies, and by extension their morality, required constant regulation. Shoes weren't just objects, they were extensions of surveillance, ensuring women conformed to both aesthetic and moral codes. Despite these pressures, some women found ways to assert agency through footwear. Practical boots or hidden padding allowed mobility and comfort, while clever styles offered subtle self-expression. Small acts of defiance, adjusting a heel height, revealing a fashionable shoe, or simply walking briskly, became methods of resistance. Women could claim autonomy in tiny, almost imperceptible ways, negotiating the narrow boundaries between superstition, decorum, and personal comfort. Tonight, as you wiggle your toes inside socks or slippers, Consider the women whose every step was scrutinized, every shoe laden with expectation. Their souls bore not just weight, but the heavy burden of propriety, superstition, and social judgment. And yet, like a whispered rebellion, some stepped lightly, confidently, and defiantly, leaving traces of independence even within the narrow confines of Victorian expectation. You're holding your stomach, just casually, maybe from a lingering ache or a bite too quickly swallowed. But in Victorian times, what went on inside your abdomen wasn't simply personal. Shadow pregnancies, phantom births, and ghost babies were considered real threats, and women's wombs were under constant moral, medical, and supernatural scrutiny. A woman could experience what we now call pseudocysis, false pregnancy, and society would treat it as proof of spiritual or moral imbalance. The idea that the womb could conjure life that didn't exist was both terrifying and strangely poetic, and for women, ma bia, it carried consequences far beyond biology. Phantom pregnancies were taken seriously. Women would exhibit all the physical signs of pregnancy: abdominal growth, nausea, hormonal shifts, even labour pains, without any actual fetus. Doctors, midwives, and families often insisted that a woman's mind was to blame, her emotions strong enough to trick her body. It wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was interpreted as a warning about vanity, sexual impropriety, or repressed desire. The body, in essence, could reflect hidden sins. And in a society obsessed with controlling women's sexuality, the false pregnancy was read as proof that women's wombs could not be trusted. Quirky fact, some Victorian manuals suggested that phantom pregnancies could be cured through a combination of rest, moral lectures, and light exercise. Some physicians recommended leeching or gentle abdominal manipulation, believing that physical intervention could correct the womb's delusions. The approach combined physiology, superstition, and paternalistic control. A woman's mind and uterus were inseparable moral barometers. If one wandered, the other followed. The fear of ghost babies wasn't limited to the afflicted woman. It extended to her social and familial standing. Families worried that phantom pregnancies could ruin reputations, disrupt marriage prospects, or indicate latent sexual deviance. In some cases, women were shunned or institutionalized after false pregnancies, especially if they had no male protector. A woman's reproductive system became a stage where morality, superstition, and medical authority intersected, often leaving her with little agency. This obsession intersected with spiritualism too. Some mediums claimed they could communicate with the lost child or identify the unborn spirit lingering in a woman's womb. Spiritual intervention was sometimes sought to ensure that the phantom baby either moved on or was acknowledged, further blending superstition, psychology, and social control. Victorian women lived in a world where even imagined life could provoke fear, censure, and moral judgment. The phenomenon of shadow pregnancies also fueled literary tropes. Novels and plays depicted women afflicted with phantom pregnancies as tragic, overly emotional, or dangerously imaginative. The trope reinforced social anxieties. If a woman's mind could create life, what else might it create? Ambition? Independence? Rebellion? Authors warned audiences that unchecked imagination could lead to physical and moral chaos, particularly in the bodies of women. Historians debate whether pseudocysis in Victorian women reflected genuine medical conditions exacerbated by stress, grief, or trauma, or whether it was more a product of social pressure and superstition. Likely it was a combination, the body responding to emotional intensity, and society interpreting those signals through a lens of fear and moral scrutiny. Either way, women's reproductive experiences were rarely private or self-determined. Despite these pressures, some women navigated phantom pregnancies with ingenuity and resilience. They kept journals, confided in trusted friends, or sought discreet medical advice. These acts allowed them to reclaim some control over experiences that society interpreted as moral or spiritual failings. In doing so, they challenged the idea that the womb was a moral battleground rather than a personal biological organ. Tonight, as you settle under your blanket and feel your own belly rise and fall with breath, imagine the weight Victorian women carried, literally and figuratively, every month, every imagined pregnancy, every bodily signal interpreted as a moral verdict. Their wombs weren't just organs, they were symbols, instruments, and judges. And yet many endured, surviving the scrutiny, superstition, and judgment with quiet defiance, claiming their lives in spite of the ghostly expectations laid upon them. You lift the teacup to your lips, watching the steam curl lazily toward the ceiling. And remember that even something as innocent as reading leaves or tea grounds could carry enormous weight in Victorian society. Tea leaf reading or tasseography was considered both entertainment and a subtle tool of social control. Women were encouraged to consult the symbols in their cup, not simply for fun, but to divine their future, assess moral alignment, or evaluate potential romantic prospects. In a culture obsessed with morality and fate, the ritual of tea leaf reading became a socially sanctioned method of guiding women's choices while keeping them comfortably confined to domestic spaces. Fortune-telling was far from harmless. The superstition surrounding tea leaf reading suggested that a woman's destiny, particularly regarding love, marriage, or fertility, could be predicted, and sometimes manipulated through small domestic rituals. A symbol of a ship in your cup might warn of a distant suitor. A circle could indicate marriage. A cross might portend moral or physical danger. These readings weren't taken lightly. Families often used them to steer daughters away from suitors deemed inappropriate, reinforcing existing social hierarchies under the guise of supernatural insight. Quirky fact: Victorian tea guides sometimes included detailed instructions for ensuring accuracy. Cups had to be inverted precisely, leaves swirled clockwise, and the tea must not be stirred with the wrong hand, usually the left for obvious sinister reasons. There were even manuals warning that certain types of tea or residue patterns could bring ill luck if read incorrectly. A single misinterpreted swirl could spell disaster, at least in a socially sanctioned sense. The practice also intersected with superstition regarding the female body. Women who were menstruating, pregnant, or experiencing emotional turmoil were often advised against reading tea leaves, lest their nervous energy distort the symbols. This reinforced the idea that women's internal states were morally and spiritually precarious, and that even a domestic ritual could have ethical or metaphysical consequences. The body, the cup, and the future were all linked in an intricate dance of caution and control. Tea leaf reading, while entertaining, became a subtle instrument of surveillance. Mothers, aunts, or chaperones might insist on overseeing the practice, interpreting outcomes as moral tests. A successful prediction reinforced virtue. A poor one suggested risk, folly, or latent sin. The ritual, therefore, was not simply about leisure. It was a way to socialize women into vigilance, obedience, and self-monitoring. In essence, teacups were mirrors of character, small vessels that reflected the pressures and anxieties imposed upon women. Literature and etiquette guides reflected and reinforced these anxieties. Novels frequently depicted young women consulting cups for love advice, sometimes leading to correct matches, often leading to social commentary on fate, morality, and female agency. By tying fortune-telling to domestic propriety, authors underscored the belief that women's futures were malleable, but only under strict supervision and according to established moral codes. Historians debate the social function of such practices. Some argue that tea leaf reading was a form of empowerment, providing women with a sanctioned space for agency within domestic confines. Others contend it reinforced patriarchal control, framing women's decisions as dependent on superstition rather than rational judgment. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Women used the ritual both to navigate social restrictions and to assert subtle influence over personal or familial outcomes. Despite the constraints, some women embraced tea divination creatively. They might secretly consult the leaves for business prospects, friendships, or personal dreams, subverting the intended moralistic framework. Others simply indulged in the ritual for comfort, community, or a sense of control in an otherwise tightly monitored domestic sphere. The cup became a medium of both constraint and quiet rebellion. Tonight, as you cradle your own teacup, real or imagined, consider the women who once peered into their leaves with both hope and caution. Each swirl, each pattern, each dot of residue carried weight far beyond caffeine or flavour. In their hands, tea leaves became instruments of guidance, surveillance, and subtle autonomy. And somewhere in those tiny symbols, perhaps, they glimpsed a future of small rebellions, whispered dreams, and defiance hidden in the steam. You tilt your head in the mirror, examining a freckle that's been there for as long as you can remember. In the Victorian era, those small marks, moles, birthmarks, and freckles, weren't just cosmetic quirks. They were portents, signs, sometimes warnings. Women's appearances were meticulously scrutinized, and anything out of place could suggest hidden moral or supernatural implications. A dark mole on the hand might indicate passion, min, or jins, danger. A cluster of freckles could signal a temperamental spirit or vulnerability to illness. Every tiny spot on the body was potentially loaded with meaning. Medical and superstitious texts abounded with interpretations. Some believed birthmarks were traces of original sin, the physical manifestation of past moral failings. Others thought they indicated character traits, romantic destiny, or even susceptibility to possession. A mole in the wrong place could suggest an obstinate nature, while a mark near the shoulder could imply hidden ambition or defiance. And because these traits were visible, society felt justified in scrutinizing, correcting, or even shaming women who bore them. Appearance was morality written on the skin. Quirky fact, there were guides advising women to cover birthmarks with makeup or clothing, not for vanity, but to prevent undue attention from spirits or suitors. In extreme cases, parents or guardians would physically obscure or remove conspicuous marks to protect a daughter's social and moral standing. Imagine being instructed to hide a small harmless freckle lest it influence your entire life. That's how seriously superficial markers were treated. The implications were practical as well as spiritual. In an age obsessed with the marriage, blemishes were often read as indicators of eligibility. A supposedly bad mark might suggest moral weakness, sexual impropriety, or future ill fortune. Suitors, families, and matchmakers took note, and a woman's social mobility could be subtly constrained by what amounted to biological superstition. Even if she was brilliant, kind, or industrious, a mole on the wrong cheek could haunt her reputation. This superstition extended to illness too. Certain birthmarks were thought to indicate vulnerability to specific diseases, particularly reproductive or nervous conditions. Women were advised to monitor, cover, or treat marks with tinctures, ointments, or protective charms. Health, virtue, and appearance were inseparably linked, and a physical blemish could be read as both moral and medical warning. Victorian literature and art reinforced these beliefs. Female characters with distinctive markings were often cast as morally ambiguous, mystical, or dangerously independent. An author might describe a heroine's mole with lengthy attention, signalling her inner complexity or hinting at impending tragedy. Physical features became narrative shorthand for personality, fate, and societal judgment. What was cosmetic became existential. Historians debate whether these interpretations were more reflective of genuine belief or an extension of patriarchal control. Some argue that the reading of birthmarks and freckles provided a subtle mechanism for policing female behaviour. Others suggest that it reflected a deeper cultural fascination with visible markers of individuality, morality, and social order. Either way, women's bodies were not neutral. They were canvases upon which social anxieties were projected. Some women subverted these superstitions in quiet ways. They might adorn a dangerous mark with jewellery, use it as a point of artistic expression, or embrace it as a unique feature of identity. In doing so, they reclaimed control over a body that society insisted was both morally and spiritually surveilled. A tiny freckle became paradoxically a site of subtle rebellion. Tonight, as you examine your own skin, marks, freckles, or scars, consider the women who once navigated a world where every dot was a moral signpost. Their bodies were public, monitored, and interpreted in ways that went far beyond health or aesthetics. And yet, in their careful adornment, concealment, or celebration of these marks, they quietly asserted agency in a society that sought to define them entirely by surface appearances. You catch a glimpse of your cheek in the lamplight and notice the curve of a dimple. In Victorian superstition, even something as seemingly innocuous as a facial feature could carry enormous significance. Dimples, moles, or even the shape of a chin were believed to reveal character, moral strength, and destiny. A slight depression in the cheek might suggest mischievousness, sensuality, or moral unpredictability. In other words, your face was a map of your virtue, or lack thereof, and women were constantly under scrutiny, their natural features read as both warning and instruction. Facial superstition was part of a larger cultural obsession with physiognomy, the belief that character could be inferred from physical appearance. Women were expected to demonstrate purity, obedience, and domestic suitability not just through behaviour, but also through the shape and expression of their faces. A crooked smile, a cleft chin, or a pronounced dimple could be interpreted as indicators of vanity, passion, or defiance. What might be considered charming today was often read as morally risky. Quirky fact, some guides recommended that women cover dimples or other dangerous features with makeup or strategically styled hair, not for beauty but for social survival. A dimple could invite unwanted attention from men, spark gossip among neighbours, or imply a rebellious temperament. In extreme cases, families pressured daughters to manipulate their expressions to present an idealised, morally acceptable face. Even a natural smile could be socially dangerous. The significance of facial features also extended to marriage and social prospects. Potential suitors were advised, often through subtle guidance from mothers or aunts, to interpret dimples and facial contours as evidence of character. A dimpled young woman might be deemed flirtatious or less suitable for domestic obedience. A smooth, unmarked face was associated with virtue, predictability, and suitability for the marital household. Appearance and morality were inseparable. This preoccupation intersected with spiritual and mystical beliefs. Some superstitions held that certain features could attract spirits, influence fortune, or reveal one's alignment with cosmic forces. A dimple on the left cheek might suggest susceptibilities to temptation, while one on the right could indicate future prosperity or marital happiness. Faces were treated as living maps of destiny, and a woman's expression could be read like a book. Victorian literature reinforced these ideas. Characters with dangerous features were often coded as morally ambiguous, mysterious, or fated for tragedy. Descriptions of dimples, clefts, or unusual facial lines were never merely aesthetic, they were loaded with symbolic meaning, shaping readers' perceptions of a woman's virtue, temperament, and potential. Authors reflected the cultural obsession with reading women's faces, embedding superstition in every descriptive sentence. Historians debate whether these facial superstitions were internalized by women themselves, or primarily a mechanism of external control. Many argue that the scrutiny women experienced created self-monitoring behaviours that governed speech, posture, and expression. Others note that these beliefs reflected broader anxieties about female autonomy, sexual agency, and social visibility. Either way, natural features were rarely neutral. They were interpreted, surveilled, and constrained. Yet some women resisted. They embraced dimples, freckles, or unusual expressions as personal identity, subtle rebellion, or points of charm. By acknowledging their features rather than hiding them, they quietly challenged a system that sought to codify morality into every contour of the body. In their faces, they asserted agency, humour, and humanity against a culture obsessed with control. Tonight, as you study your own features in the soft glow of a lamp, think of the women who lived under the gaze of superstition. Each curve, mark, and dimple was scrutinized for character and destiny, yet they persisted, smiling, frowning, and expressing themselves in ways both ordinary and radical. And in that quiet act of living and looking, they found a small, precious freedom. You lean forward and realize that sometimes silence itself was the safest choice. In the Victorian era, a woman's voice was powerful but dangerously so. Speaking too much, too boldly, or in the wrong context could invite moral suspicion, gossip, or even accusations of witchcraft. The belief was that women who articulated their opinions, or expressed desires, doubts, or emotions too freely, risked attracting misfortune or spiritual disturbance. In a society that prized female decorum, restraint wasn't just etiquette, it was survival. Silence became a kind of shield, a socially sanctioned form of protection. The expectation of silence extended into almost every sphere. In the home, women were expected to defer to husbands, fathers, and male relatives. In public, their opinions were secondary, their laughter measured, their speech monitored. Speaking without invitation or raising a contentious point could result in social censure, whispers of hysteria, or allegations of emotional instability. A strong-willed woman was often labelled troublesome, over-emotional, or unnatural. In essence, her voice could threaten the carefully ordered moral and social ecosystem of Victorian life. Quirky fact, etiquette manuals advised women to answer questions only when asked, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves in conversation. Overly enthusiastic responses could indicate improper ambition, moral weakness, or excessive nerve activity. In some instances, women were even taught to pause before speaking, carefully weighing their words to avoid offence, or to avoid triggering supernatural repercussions. The act of speaking was framed as both a moral and metaphysical responsibility. This culture of enforced silence intersected with superstition. Some believed that women who spoke too freely risked inviting spirits or bad luck into the household. Others claimed that outspoken women were more susceptible to emotional instability or hysteria. The moral universe of the time conflated speech, gender, and physical health. A careless word could endanger not just reputation, but body and spirit. Communication itself became a site of caution and control. Silence was also tied to marital expectations. Wives were expected to be compliant, agreeable, and quiet, particularly in households where husbands wielded both emotional and legal authority. Speaking up about dissatisfaction, disagreement, or ambition could be interpreted as disobedience or moral corruption. The consequences could range from social ridicule to institutionalization, making the regulation of speech a deeply entrenched form of patriarchal power. Victorian literature frequently dramatized the dangers of female expression. Characters who defied the norm by speaking their minds often faced tragic consequences, reinforcing the notion that women's voices were dangerous when uncontrolled. At the same time, subtle portrayals of clever, quiet, or hidden speech allowed some female characters to assert influence without overt rebellion. The narrative tension highlighted the delicate balance between social conformity and personal agency. Historians debate the extent to which women internalize these expectations versus strategically using silence as a form of power. Some suggest that enforced quiet fostered creativity and subtle influence in letter writing, domestic management, and personal networks. Others argue that silence reinforced oppression, teaching women to doubt the value of their thoughts and the legitimacy of their experiences. In reality, it likely did both, constraining overt expression while opening hidden avenues for subtle negotiation. Despite the risks, women found ways to assert their voices quietly. Letters, diaries, and coded communication allowed for intellectual and emotional expression beyond the immediate supervision of family or society. Humour, art, and domestic storytelling became channels for self-expression under the guise of acceptable behaviour. Silence, in this context, was both imposed and creatively adapted, a complex tool of survival and subtle resistance. Tonight, as you settle into your bed and feel the calm of your surroundings, consider the women who learned to navigate a world in which speaking freely could be dangerous. Their silence was not simply submission. It was strategy, restraint, and sometimes rebellion. They used it to protect themselves, to observe, and to influence quietly, asserting control in spaces society had designed to limit them. And in that careful, deliberate quiet, they preserved their power, identity, and sometimes their very lives.